A lone Volkswagen sped down the road, kicking up dust and dirt. A jeep was in hot pursuit behind it, leaving a similar cloud of dust behind. Berlin was being closed in on by the Red Army. Nazi Germany was on the brink of collapse, its armies losing on all fronts, be them land, air, or sea. And a Volkswagen Type 82 Kübelwagen with its top down, stuffed full with 6 extremists, even among the Reich's most insane members, was speeding down a dirt road in Poland. Pursuing them were 2 United States Navy sailors, who shouldn't have even been in the middle of Poland, but they were. And John Bride and William Phillips knew they couldn't let this small group escape and potentially cause who knew how much havoc. Bride leaned out of the passenger side window of the Jeep and fired several shots from his rifle at the fleeing Volkswagen, but getting a good shot was difficult from both the distance he was at and the speed the target was traveling. He leaned back inside the Jeep and ejected the spent clip, sliding a replacement inside. He looked back up and saw the vehicle was getting further away. Come on, he urged Phillips. Phillips changed the gear of the vehicle and coaxed more speed out of it. They began to close the distance, and the Volkswagen swerved a bit. Taking the opportunity, Phillips pushed the gas pedal down and drove up alongside the German vehicle. He and Bride looked over at it and saw several desperate but insane-looking faces staring back at them. The obvious commander, a Nazi colonel sitting in the back seat, who was holding a bell-shaped object, shouted something at the driver, and the Volkswagen began to pull ahead again. Phillips and Bride ended up in this desperate chase by pure chance. The two were both still physically wrecked from their secret mission just the night before. They'd been sent into territory under Nazi control to stop the Nazis' secret gold train. After a long trek across the countryside, the two had tracked it down the night before, boarding it like cowboys in the Wild West and trying to hold it up. A short but vicious battle had ensued on the roof of the train cars, which had been traveling on a secret line built specifically for hiding away the Nazis' stolen treasures. With the Allied line advancing, the Germans had tried to flee with as much of their stolen gold and artifacts as possible, along with, no doubt, some secret projects they didn't want the Allies finding. The thought of trying to stop it with a full army sounded nearly impossible, but sending just 2 men made it sound like an insanity-driven move that could never have been accomplished. And that was the exact point. Phillips and Bride had been sent into Poland to do that impossible task by a higher-ranking individual named General Ehrenmohr. In reality, he didn't ever want the train stopped. He'd wanted the two to die trying to stop it, and it was a convenient excuse to explain their deaths. They'd witnessed a top-secret experiment in 1943, one that would have caused huge public outcry if ever revealed. For that reason, the general had wanted to ensure that they never talked. They had been 2 of the key witnesses to the experiment, seen its effects firsthand, and had their respective siblings disappear because of it. In Ehrenmohr's view, that was likely a good motivation for them to one day talk about it. Because of that, they had found themselves in Poland a year and a half after the Philadelphia experiment, on a mission they were not sent to complete but to die on. But they hadn't. They had failed to stop the train, or even recover any of the gold or artifacts on board, but they had both survived and been found by fellow American ground forces later that morning, badly beaten up but alive, and they decided that they were okay with failing their task, simply because they had survived. They'd first encountered the Germans they were now in pursuit of while driving back to a town that had been fortified into an Allied encampment to get treated for the wounds they'd suffered in the train battle. The two had suffered multiple injuries, including gunshot wounds, trauma to their necks, and severe bruising on their backs and shoulders from falling off the train. The field medics had given them what they could, but the two were told they needed a more thorough checkup than they could give them in the front lines. After being told they needed a more thorough treatment elsewhere, well further back in territory under Allied control where actual hospitals were, the 2 Navy sailors had commandeered an unneeded vehicle that the battalion didn't mind lending them once they had their strength back. The skies were clear of planes by that time, and they were told the road heading back to one of the larger liberated towns, which was pointed out on a map for them, would be cleared of traps such as landmines on behalf of the Allied forces pushing through Poland. Even though they were traveling into territory under Allied control, they were given rifles and handguns just in case they ran into any unexpected Nazi holdouts dug in somewhere. Shortly before noon, Phillips and Bride had loaded themselves into a Ford GPW to drive back to the liberated town and get treated for their injuries. For several miles, the drive through the Polish countryside was uneventful. Here it almost looked untouched. It wasn't scarred like the coastlines of Normandy or the islands in the Pacific were. They followed the road without incident until they were approaching a T-junction, with the road continuing ahead and turning off to the right. To their left, just off the road, was a barn. As they approached the junction, which they were going to head straight through, the barn doors suddenly burst open and the Volkswagen had driven out, speeding down the road to the sailors' right. Following the first vehicle was a motorcycle. That had been the incident which had started the chase Phillips and Bride were now on. A random encounter by nothing more than pure chance. When the motorcycle had tried to follow the Volkswagen, Bride, who was in the passenger seat of the Jeep he and Phillips had commandeered from their friends, had stood up, leaned out of the window, and fired a single shot. The bullet had struck the driver and the vehicle skidded over with a crash. The two sailors had rushed out of the Jeep towards the wounded Nazi soldier, who had been rolling on the ground, a bleeding bullet wound oozing out of the side of his chest. Meanwhile, the Volkswagen had continued speeding down the road into the distance, leaving only a dust cloud behind and the fading roar of its engine. The wounded soldier had been reaching for his weapon when the sailors ran up and pointed their own at him. "Don't!" Phillips had shouted. With a wheezing cough, the Nazi had rolled onto his back and looked up at the two sailors. They took their eyes off him for a moment to watch the fleeing Volkswagen speed off. Then the sound of the wounded soldier laughing made them turn their gazes back to him. Despite the obvious searing pain he was in, the man was laughing at them. Phillips took a step in closer and shoved his rifle in the man's face. "What's so funny?" he hissed through gritted teeth. The man kept laughing and Phillips reacted again. "Talk!" The man began rambling, but Bride interrupted him. "In English," he'd said, in both English then in German. He didn't know much German, but he did know that. The dying man spat some blood out of his mouth before locking eyes with the Americans. "You're fools. You might be marching through Europe to Germany's borders, but you've still lost the war." At that, Phillips grabbed the man by the collar of his uniform. He got right in the dying Nazi's face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. The man laughed painfully again. Then, he said one final thing before dying. "They have the Die Glocke." Even in death, his eyes had the gleam of an insane fanatic, imagining a world remade in their own image. Phillips and Bride had heard rumors of such a device, or rather of such a weapon. Information about it had leaked and spread around sometime in mid-1944. No one knew what it really was or if it was real. It was more like a scary campfire story. Some rumors had said that it was an anti-gravity weapon, but the more common theory was that the Die Glocke was a time machine. How it worked, everyone could only theorize. When the rumors had first come out, it was supposedly due to the fact the device had in fact been tested. The original rumors they also heard made it sound like the device was huge, but now it seemed like, in reality, it was a small, easily transportable device and not a giant 12-foot tall one tethered in one place, supposedly a Stonehenge-like ring of concrete. They'd been skeptical. Sure, their own government had participated in absolutely insane experiments in the past, such as the one they had seen. But the story seemed more like Nazi Germany's own misinformation and fear campaign, perhaps one inspired by the one the Allies had pulled on them with the fake army before the Normandy invasion. A campaign to make the Allies second-guess themselves about what the Nazis' capabilities really were, even after they had turned on the defensive. Phillips and Bride hadn't known if the dying man was serious, or if the device even worked as it was said to. But they knew they couldn't take a chance of something like that was actually real and working, staying in the Nazis' hands. So, they'd ran back to their vehicle, jumped in, and sped off down the road after the Volkswagen. They knew the possible ramifications if the Die Glocke was real. It didn't have to be said aloud. They were nightmarish. Even being able to turn a ship invisible would be obsolete compared to having the power to travel through time and change the course of history. They had heard the Germans were working on Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, but never believed any had come to fruition. Not until they'd seen some proof some at least had been in development on the train. But it seemed that one did, and the one that did was possibly the most dangerous one that ever could have. And considering where they'd stumbled across the Germans and the fact documents describing Wunderwaffe had been on the gold train, Phillips and Bride suspected that it had been something planned to be placed on the train, but it hadn't arrived in time. Perhaps the group they were now chasing had gotten held up by the American and other Allied ground forces marching through the region. With how small the splinter group was, they wouldn't have had a hope in the world if they had been noticed by a full company of soldiers. Phillips and Bride suspected that the group had been hiding in the barn once they knew they'd missed the train, trying to plan out their next move, and their arrival had spooked them into making a run for it. So here they were, chasing a group of desperate Nazis, not knowing if the device they supposedly had in their possession was even real or if it had been a final scare tactic. But as it turned out, it most certainly was real. When the colonel in charge of the splinter group had noticed the American vehicle approaching, he ordered his group to escape rather than stay and risk being discovered backed into a corner. Colonel Hermann Woremann was a very cold and calculating individual, and perhaps one of the most fanatic individuals in the entirety of the remaining German army. He planned his moves well, was known as a merciless individual one should fear, and savored victory. He had only grown more devoted and extreme in his views after being on the losing end of a serious battle earlier in the year, the Battle of the Bulge. Afterward, when he'd come to realize the war was going to be lost if nothing changed, he'd taken matters into his own hands, and the current plan he was preparing to initiate was the result. He had the eyes of an insane fanatic, like the others in the vehicle, but the calm mind of a calculating commander who wasn't blinded by his fanaticism. He had carefully planned out what he would do next, what they would do, to change the outcome of the war. He had thought long and hard about doing it, but had decided that it was best. It was the only way for Germany to win the war now. As he sat in the back seat of the vehicle, he thought about what would happen next. Despite everything happening in Poland at that time in April 1945, Woremann maintained his attire. A commander in good attire gave the illusion of stability to those under your command. There was not an uncombed hair under his visor. There was not a spot on his face that was unshaven. His blue eyes were cold, calm, and his long black hair was perfectly straight. His uniform was still crisp and clean, without a speck of dirt to be seen anywhere. His medals were arranged dutifully, and they all sat flat and level against his chest, not leaving a single one crooked. He always stood with his back straight. While the regime may have been on the brink of collapse, Bormann's appearance gave off the illusion that its army was as strong and unbreakable as ever, with no blemishes and nothing out of place. But his mind was a different story. Everything had gone wrong in 1944, when Hitler had incorrectly guessed where the Allies would make their landing for their invasion of Europe. Hitler knew the Allies would attack, but he'd assumed it would be where the English Channel was at its thinnest. In reality, the Allies attacked much further to the south, and from there, they'd broken through every chink in Nazi Germany's armor until they peeled it away completely. Thankfully, the device he cradled in his hands would change that. The Die Glocke was a wonderful invention. It was a true shame that those who had built it had to suffer the end they had endured, but it couldn't be helped. When Woremann had decided to retrieve the Die Glocke from the lab it was built in, he'd ordered his little posse of werewolf fighters to gun down all the scientists and technicians, along with the few soldiers who had been guarding it, in the lab as well. This was so none could live to be potentially captured by the Allies and talk about what they'd worked on. It was simply too important that it remained a secret. It was a shame in Vormann's eyes, but it had to be done, and he gave the action no further thought from that. The insane unit under his command had eagerly carried out the attack, and cleared the rooms as Woremann marched into the lab behind them, his cold gaze passing over dead bodies without an inkling of concern or remorse creeping into his gaze. Once in the lab, he had personally gone and retrieved the device. Stolen might have been the better word, but at this point it didn't matter. All that mattered, first, was getting it away from the approaching Allied line. At first, Woremann had intended to take the device to the gold train and present his idea to his fellow high-ranking commanders who were still in the country. The train would have been the largest gathering of them in the area. With the Die Glocke, he knew he could convince them. The device might have still been in very experimental stages, but it worked, and it could change the outcome of the war if someone would only use it. Woremann had been on the gold train the day before, and had tried to convince his fellow leaders of his plan then, but no one would listen to his plan without the Die Glocke in hand. None would give him the men he needed to go and retrieve it. Woremann had pleaded with the colonel in charge of the gold train mission to understand reason. He'd given him documents describing what the Die Glocke could do, but the man had refused to listen and just thrown the documents down on a table in one of the passenger cars and left once the train arrived at one of its final stops. Distraught, Woremann had watched him leave in silence. At that moment, after many arguments, Woremann made his own decision on how to proceed. He'd left his soldiers behind as part of the German defensive line further down the tracks, but nonetheless, he'd left the train at that same stop, taken a vehicle from the station, and gone alone. On his way to the lab to liberate the Die Glocke, he'd run across a small group of 5 leaderless, but just as insane and desperate as he was, members of the Werewolf Unit, a Nazi resistance force whose mission was to operate behind enemy lines as the Allies advanced through Germany. They'd been aimless and without purpose when he'd happened upon them, and quickly joined him on his mission to remedy the seemingly inevitable outcome of the war as it was at the time. He'd felt confident that they would serve his mission better than the soldiers he had left behind. The Die Glocke itself was bell-shaped. It was around double the size of a football, despite the leaked information ballooning its size to that of 2 men. That was not the case in reality, and how those leaks had even gotten out, no one knew. But if it was someone on the inside, then Woremann saw it as all the more reason to do what he did at the lab. The metal the device was made from was hard, especially for how small the device was, and the bell-shaped device was much heavier to hold than it appeared to be at first glance. On the bottom of the bell was a series of several dials, knobs, and tally-like counters. These counters showed 2 dates and 2 sets of coordinates, one labeled Original Departure/Anchor Date Location, and the other Arrival Date Location. The original departure tally counter showed the date and coordinates that one would leave from, and the other showed when and where they would be going. There was also a knob that could switch the eras from AD to BC. But the scope of time one could travel to in either direction was limited. The tally counters that indicated the destination and departure year were limited to 4 digits each. As a result, anything from 9,999 AD to 9,999 BC was the limit that the Die Glocke, a groundbreaking but primitive device, could travel to. The Die Glocke itself was powered by a purplish-colored liquid, a metallic liquid that was highly radioactive but was insulated in the device's fuel tank, and it was known as Serum 525. The tank inside the Die Glocke was full. In the lab there had been tubes that ran into it for a near endless supply of Serum 525, but the Fanatic group had disconnected those once they raided the lab and took it, leaving the Die Glocke with a fuel supply limited to what was in the tank at the time. It had been full. The tank inside the Die Glocke was full of the stuff, and it was enough for 4 uses before needing refilled. 4 uses of the Die Glocke would completely deplete the stock that was in its tank, leaving it useless without any more available. The fuel, Serum 525, itself was an irradiated form of mercury that served not only as fuel to power the device, but also as something to give it the jump start or initial propulsion needed for what it had been designed to do. and that was to punch a hole into time, as the device was capable of distorting space and time itself. The leaked information had gotten the size wrong. It had gotten one other thing right, though. The fact that the Die Glocke was, in essentials, a time machine. It would allow the user to travel through a hole in space-time that it would force open to a date and location of their choosing. All one had to do was set a date and location, not a time, as you would arrive at your destination at the same time you left your original era, and follow a few other simple steps to allow the device to open a hole in space-time you could pass through. And this was Woremann's plan: to use the Die Glocke to go back in time to 1944 and tip off Hitler about the Normandy invasion. Hitler had been convinced that the Allies would try to make their landing over 200 miles away than they ultimately did, but Woremann had been at Normandy, and he had seen everything that happened when the Allies finally came. He'd seen them storm the beaches, climb the hills, destroy and bury their bunkers, get a foothold in Europe. The moment everything had gone wrong, the moment the tide forever turned, the moment where the mistake that was leading to Germany's defeat could be fixed. If the Allied invasion of Europe failed, then Woremann felt the mistakes that led to defeat would be corrected. He knew that if the failure of June 6, 1944 could be righted, then so could the outcome of the war. Unlike Hitler, he had accepted that the war could not be won unless something changed, and he believed the Die Glocke was the device that would be that very thing. He was a man far too devoted to the Third Reich to allow it and his vision for what a perfect world would be under its rule to die. Unlike Hitler, Woremann was not going to cower and hide in a bunker, accept that all was lost and do nothing. But, just as Hitler had lost his mind, Woremann did too, just in a different way. He'd only become more fanatic. The plan to win the war that resulted from his own mental state was completely insane, but he knew it would work. He carefully calculated everything. The Die Glocke was the only way. Of course, the Red Army was also something to contend with, but in Woremann's view, the breach in Europe to the west was more important to quell first. With the Die Glocke, there would be plenty of opportunities to stop the advance of the Red Army later, perhaps even without it. If the Allies in the west were repelled, more troops could be diverted to force the Red Army away, this time with the appropriate gear needed that they lacked the first time. When the group had been held up by the Allied push through Poland, and missed the gold train's last stop, they had held up in the barn to debate their next move. Woremann had intended to again propose his plan to his fellow leaders when he reached the train, make them see that it was the only way. From there, they could plan what their implementation would have been once the train reached its destination. If they didn't see reason, Woremann and his posse of werewolves could have done it anyway. But none of that had been possible once they had missed the train, and the group of 6 had been forced to choose if they could still pull the plan off. The arrival of the 2 Americans had settled the debate and prompted action. They would use the Die Glocke to win the war. To use the device, they first needed to attain enough speed and had burst out of the barn to escape before any chance of them being discovered could pass. The destination they were going was a month before the invasion. Once there, Woremann would tell Hitler exactly what was going to happen, and then help him plan the defensive that would keep the Allied invasion from succeeding. And, even if somehow they did push through, Woremann knew every battle to come, every defeat Germany could change into a victory, every surprise move by the Allies. He couldn't lose. The Die Glocke made total victory possible. It was the only thing that did. How none of his fellow commanders had seen that earlier baffled him, but it didn't matter. He had the Die Glocke now, and he did see what no one else had. Woremann was setting it up when the others crammed into the vehicle alongside him, began shouting as the American vehicle pulled up alongside them. The colonel had looked over, locked eyes with the 2, and ordered the driver to speed up and get away from them. The other werewolves had done the same, shouted and screamed to get away before the Americans could run them off the road and ruin everything. Woremann, meanwhile, once he'd given the order, had went back to turning the knobs and dials on the Die Glocke, setting it up and getting it ready. He was setting the coordinates for where they would go and their arrival date. Meanwhile, Phillips and Bride kept the chase up. Bride could see that the colonel in the vehicle was leaning over what had to be the device, messing with a series of knobs and dials. He pointed. "They're doing something!" They didn't know if it was real. They didn't know that Vormann's plan was to go back to 1944 and tip off Hitler that the Allies would invade Normandy. They didn't need to. They knew the potential ramifications if the device was real, and it was enough to spur them onward into action. As crazy as it sounded, a time machine, if it was real, then they knew it was a chance they couldn't take. Something like that absolutely could not remain in the hands of such an insane regime who were only growing more desperate. If the Die Glocke was real, it could easily let the Nazis turn the war around in their favor. A time machine could do so much damage to so many events that shaped how the war was playing out. And they had no doubt the Nazis had experimented with something so potentially dangerous. They'd seen their own leaders attempt to do insane things to get better odds at winning the war. The terrifying results of the Philadelphia experiment were still seared into their minds, as fresh and vivid as they'd been on the day they occurred. The lengths both sides were going to win the war was terrifying. Anything was on the table, even unorthodox things, like the Die Glocke. Phillips and Bride could not let it stay in the Nazis' hands, especially if they were indeed about to actually use it. Phillips gave the engine all the gas he could, and they slowly crept up alongside the Volkswagen again. The soldiers looked at the two Americans as they pulled alongside them, their eyes wide and wild. But the colonel was still fiddling with the bell-shaped device in his hands, now with even more desperate vigor. "Bride, take the wheel," Phillips said. "What? Why?" Bride demanded. "Just do it," Phillips snapped. Reaching over and grabbing the wheel, Bride held it steady as Phillips let go. Phillips climbed out of the driver's seat, and he and Bride switched seats, managing to do so without losing any of their speed. As soon as he was in the passenger side, Phillips didn't stay seated. "Get right alongside it," Phillips ordered, slinging his rifle over his shoulders. Bride maneuvered in next to the Volkswagen. Phillips crouched in the passenger seat, and as soon as they were right alongside it, as the Germans were raising their weapons towards him and Bride, he leapt out of the Jeep and into the Volkswagen, straight on top of the colonel and several other troops. Bride pulled the Jeep away slightly from the shock of the moment. "Phillips! God damn it!" Bride shouted, taking his eyes off the Volkswagen and looking at the road again to avoid losing control of the Jeep. He kept it steady and looked over at the Volkswagen again. Phillips was struggling with at least 3 of the soldiers in the other vehicle. He was on top of the colonel, and Bride saw him take a swing that connected with the face of one of the troops next to him. Glancing behind him, Bride spotted an ammunition box sitting in the back seat of the Jeep. Still looking at the road, he reached back and fumbled until he felt it. He grabbed it and pulled it up to the front with him, thankful it seemed to be full. He stuffed the heavy metal box onto the floorboard, pressing it against the gas pedal to keep the Jeep moving. Then, with the road ahead straight, he grabbed his rifle, stood up, and also leapt into the Volkswagen, landing in the front of the vehicle, which swerved when he collided with the driver. Behind him, the Jeep veered off the road and crashed into a large tree, its bumper and frame caving in and its back tires lifting off the ground. The Germans were all shouting as the struggle for the Die Glocke continued, the vehicle gaining speed and veering out of control. The driver couldn't do much with Bride laying on top of him, but leaned as far back as possible and tried to keep the vehicle from crashing. Phillips kept trying to reach for the Die Glocke, but Woremann kept it out of his reach, still trying to finish setting the device up as he did. One of the werewolves grabbed Phillips, and he leaned up and nailed a powerful punch into the man's face. He tumbled backwards and over the door and off the side of the Volkswagen onto the ground. Bride, meanwhile, was struggling with the trooper in the front passenger seat. It was an even matchup, neither gaining an advantage over the other. Woremann suddenly shouted in a loud voice, and Bride picked up enough of the words to understand what had happened. "Phillips! He's got it ready! It's working!" he shouted as he tried to overpower the werewolf he was tangled with. And the Die Glocke was clearly working, because ahead, down the road, was an area of space that appeared to be warping, lensing, and bending, and the Volkswagen was speeding straight towards it. "Oh God," Bride said as he saw it. Phillips saw it too, and, out of desperation, He shook the werewolf, holding him off, and grabbed for the Die Glocke. He didn't try to pull it from Woremann's hands. He just reached under its base and spun as many of the knobs as he could, turning them to a random date, location, everything. Woremann shouted as this happened and tried to push Phillips away, but the Die Glocke began rattling slightly. Then the top and bottom sections of the device began to spin in counter rotations as it began working. A bolt of strange colored lightning, almost a shimmering, rippling blue color, seemed to materialize from out of nowhere with a loud boom and strike the spot where it looked like reality was stretching and distorting. Then, at that spot, reality and space itself seemed to be forcefully peeled away by invisible claws. It seemed to tear open like a seam unzipping. A mist formed around the edges of the hole, but there was clearly something on the other side. The device truly worked. A hole in space and time had just been opened, and visible through it was the date, time, and location of the random spin Phillips had done on the knobs. And the Volkswagen was speeding straight into it. Looking completely disheveled now, Woremann tried to change the settings back, but it did no good. The hole in time had been opened, and the Volkswagen sped straight through it. Location and date unknown. The Volkswagen came out of the tear on the other side, through the small gateway of mist that had been on the other side, and the driver instantly stopped the vehicle so suddenly that its tires screeched and left burn marks on the road. Everyone was thrown forward by the momentum. The road was the reason the driver had stopped. Why, everyone had. No one was fighting, speaking, or moving. They were staring forward with shock and confusion on their faces. No one could comprehend what they were seeing. Ahead, the road was dilapidated, crumbled, and had clearly not been maintained in a long time. It was paved with two faded yellow lines going down its center. Dense trees covered in strange vines loomed over both sides of the road. Buildings, clearly long abandoned and overgrown in the same vines, stood on each side of the road. Some of the trees looked familiar, and several others looked very strange, like the ones Bride remembered seeing in illustrations in a book about some of the terrible lizards that he'd read once. The air was warm and very humid. Sitting in one of the trees overlooking the road was some type of strange-looking small primate. Its fur was brown, and there was a white ring around its hairless face. The small primate, which didn't even look like it was a foot tall, squeaked and scampered away into the trees, hiding in the vines. No one noticed it, nor did they know that it was an Epidium. Such a fact would have been even more difficult to comprehend had they understood what it meant. What they were focused on was that the homes were empty, the roads were not maintained, the world was silent, save for birds and insects. Everything looked abandoned, empty of people. It was such an alien thing to see that none of the 7 people in the Volkswagen reacted for several moments as they took in the impossible sight. Behind them, the mist faded away, and the distortion in reality, the hole in space-time, closed, smoothed out, and returned to normal. Phillips and Bride recovered first. Using the opportunity while the Germans were stunned at the sight of the world in ruins, Phillips grabbed the Die Glocke from Woremann's slack hands, and he and Bride jumped out of the vehicle. Phillips set the device on the ground between him and Bride, and they raised their rifles and began shouting at the Nazis. "Drop your guns, now!" Phillips ordered. Still seeming to be in a daze, the werewolves complied and threw their pistols and rifles out of the vehicle and raised their hands. The weapons clattered onto the pavement as they were thrown. A moment after the others, Colonel Woremann also pulled his PPK sidearm out of its holster and also threw it onto the pavement. He didn't seem to be shook like the others. Shocked, yes, but not shook. His cold eyes were already calculating a next move, so both Phillips and Bride pointed their rifles at him. "Go on, go!" Phillips shouted, keeping the colonel in his sight. Verschwinden! Bride added, gesturing with his gun for them to drive on. The Nazi still looked overwhelmed. The driver even seemed to just be moving with automatic motions as he adjusted the stick shift. But Woremann didn't have that overwhelmed look. He seemed to just accept the order to leave without fighting it, without making a move to get the Die Glocke back. For someone willing to do something so drastic to change the outcome of the war, Phillips and Bride felt that he was giving up very easily. But neither had the chance to decide to shoot him because he shouted an order and the driver pushed the gas pedal to the floor and the Volkswagen took off, kicking up leaves and sticks in its wake. Phillips and Bride watched as it took off down the rough, crumbling road, leaving them behind. They kept the vehicle at gunpoint as it sped off and didn't lower their weapons until it was out of sight and the sound of its engine was fading away, being replaced by the noise from the insects. Once they did, Phillips immediately picked the Die Glocke back up as Bride took in the scene. What's happening? Where are we? Bride asked. Where is everybody? Phillips examined the bell-shaped device and flipped it over to look at the base. We're at 40 degrees, 31 minutes, 9.8 seconds north, 84 degrees, 16 minutes, 11.6 degrees west. What? Bride asked, shaking his head as he thought about that position. That would... okay. That would put us somewhere in western Ohio. Slightly slack-jawed, he stared wide-eyed at Phillips. Phillips did a slight double-take and re-examined the bottom of the device, looking at the other tally counters. He shook his head. This says the date is July 8th. He trailed off, and then spoke the year aloud with a slight sputter. 2045. What? Bride asked for the second time. He dropped his gun and grasped his hair. No. That can't be right. He turned and pointed at Phillips with a slight chuckle of denial. That's not possible. He stopped pacing, knowing that it had to be. They both had seen reality itself tear open and then watched as they passed through the hole. What happened then? You don't think the war did end up destroying the world somehow? Couldn't have, Phillips said. How do you know? Bride questioned. Because, Phillips replied, shaking his head and pointing at one of the abandoned houses. I've never seen a car like that. Bride looked and realized Phillips was right. Even rusting and with shattered windows, the car sitting outside of the house was slick, much more streamlined and less boxy than one they'd ever seen. It was a large vehicle, resting on wheels and strings of long rotted tires. And even though it was very rusted, some of its original white paint was still visible. Hesitantly approaching, Bride opened the front passenger side door. It creaked loudly and sounded like it was going to fall off the frame. It didn't. Bride pulled it open and leaned inside and shuffled through some of the compartments in the car until he pulled a piece of paper with some faded text out from the glove box. Bride scanned it. Something caught his eyes and it almost made him faint. He climbed out of the car and showed Phillips. It was a vehicle registration tag. Bride pointed at one specific detail and showed it to Phillips. The vehicle's date of registration was 2038. Bride suddenly felt his hand shaking and nearly dropped the paper. Oh God. It worked. It really worked, Bride said. We're over 100 years into the future. Sweat broke out on Bride's face, and it wasn't just from the heat. Unsure of what to do next, the two stood by the car for a few minutes, taking in the reality of their situation and that something catastrophic had happened sometime after 2038 that resulted in an apparent total collapse of civilization, and trying to figure out how to make the Die Glocke work so they could open a hole back to 1945. The sound of a deep bellow that physically shook the both of them coming from one of the nearby tree lines made them stop. Even with the loud sounds of the summertime insects, they heard the sound of something very large and heavy moving through the trees somewhere out of sight. Phillips grabbed Bride's shoulder. "Come on, let's get out of the open," he prompted. They grabbed Bride's dropped weapon and then hurried off the road and into the forest behind one of the crumbling houses. The area seemed like it had once been a residential neighborhood, but the trees and vines had all overgrown the area. Proceeding slowly, Bride held his weapon up and ready. Phillips was holding the Die Glocke, having to carry it. His rifle was slung over his shoulder. They left the dense trees behind and found themselves in an opening, likely an area once fully devoid of trees and plants, but now was overgrown with knee-high grass. Ahead was the half-concealed, collapsing ruin of an industrial warehouse, metal shards sticking up from the wall and roof towards the sky. "Let's go there," Phillips prompted. He and Bride proceeded across the field and came to what must have been one of the old roads, or even the parking lot. Because the grass was replaced with gravel, the remains of crumbling pavement, with weeds growing through the cracks in the ground. They were nearing the closest opening, not a door, but instead a collapsed section of wall that made a hole, when something squawked somewhere behind them in the tree line. They both turned and looked back toward the trees for a moment, but saw and heard nothing else. So they turned to go inside when something else jumped out in front of them. Landing on a large piece of collapsed metal next to them, a massive black shape bounded up onto it and roared at them. Phillips and Bride jumped back and stumbled away from it. Phillips dropped the Die Glocke, and he and Bride raised their weapons. The thing was snarling, crouched on all fours and glaring at them. Snarling, it slinked off the pile and crept towards them on all fours. Bride knew he had to be crazy at this point, but the thing, honest to God, looked like a dinosaur, at least in shape. The dinosaur-looking creature was down on all fours. It had 2 legs and was clearly a biped, a theropod like an allosaurus. But it had 2 long arms as well, and was clearly comfortable walking either upright or down on all fours as it was at that moment. Its body, back, shoulders, tail, neck, and head were covered in a thick, rigid armor. Bride doubted he and Phillips's bullets would even be able to penetrate the armor. At the end of its tail were 3 rows of spikes like those Bride had seen in illustrations of Stegosaurus. Running down its back were also a series of spikes growing from its spine. In its mouth was not a typical row of teeth one would see on a dinosaur, but instead, it was a single row running down the middle of the upper and lower jaws. Its teeth were serrated, like shark teeth. Its eyes lacked visible pupils and were blank, and glowed a bioluminescent yellow. On its neck were what looked like a series of open slits, and Bride quickly realized that they were gills. On its hands were 3 fingers and a thumb, each ending in a long claw. On its feet were 3 toes like a bird, complete with webbing between the toes. Each toe also ended in a claw, with the innermost toe on each foot having a much longer sickle claw than the other 2. On the back of its skull were thick, spike-like quills. The biggest shock of all of it was the fact that on one of its arms was burned the number 000002. The dinosaur had clearly been designed by someone and branded with an identification number, like the Wunderwaffe Phillips and Bride were currently guarding. Humans had made it. Phillips fired a shot at the creature, but the bullet bounced off its skull, deflected by the thick armor, just as Bride had predicted. The bullet didn't even scratch it. It just caused the creature to snarl more viciously. Phillips's grip on his rifle slackened a bit at the sight, and his mouth fell open. Then the creature did something neither of them expected. Instead of rushing at them and tearing them apart, it didn't react to being shot with violence, but instead, it spoke. "Who are you?" it demanded, still snarling, baring its teeth threateningly, looking ready to pounce at any moment. Phillips and Bride couldn't process it. They couldn't answer. Their brains just could not comprehend what had just happened. It was too alien, too absurd to process. The thing stalked much closer to them. "Who are you?" it demanded again. Phillips and Bride remained flabbergasted. Finally, Bride eked out an answer, the first word that came to his mind. Sailors. The creature stopped and actually cocked its head to the side at that. The quills on the back of its head rose. The thing responded to that with confusion. Sailors? The creature questioned. It didn't seem like it believed them. It clearly wasn't satisfied. Despite the fact that the situation they were in wasn't normal, Bride managed to format a response. We're not from here. We're from 1945. He managed to spill out despite his shock. Now the creature seemed to be the confused one. You're what? It asked, the hostile tension fading from its body as it spoke. Phillips and Bride still couldn't believe that it was talking, even as it continued to do so. The creature dropped the act after a moment and stood up on its hind legs rather than remaining down on all fours. Standing on its hind legs, it stood around 10 feet tall and it looked down at the two. It shook its head. It didn't seem to believe them. The creature, who was indeed a man-made hybrid animal, simply named Version 2 because that was all he ever was when he was created, no longer thought the two strangers were a threat. He didn't believe them when they said that they were from 100 years ago, but he could tell that the two were alone, that they were scared, and that they didn't seem like a threat at the moment. Likely, their fear had caused them to blurt out anything that they could think of. He decided to throw them a bone and help them out. Once you two have time to collect yourselves, I want real answers, Version 2 said. But for now, you shouldn't stay out there. It's dangerous. Come on inside the building, he prompted, motioning with a gesture of his head and going inside the same hole in the wall that Phillips and Bride had been planning to. He walked inside and spoke again. I don't let random strangers stay in the territory of the community I live in. You can't trust people you find out here. You better convince me that you're not trouble. It then went inside and out of sight. Feeling unable to do anything else, it was like their moves were being prompted by an unseen force. Phillips and Bride slowly lowered their weapons, grabbed the Die Glocke, and walked inside after the creature. The inside was like a cavern. Plenty of room for Phillips, Bride, and the mystery creature watching them. Deciding to pretend it wasn't there, Phillips and Bride made a fire and gathered some firewood from the nearby forest, while being watched by the creature. And by the time the sun had set, they were sitting by it, still fiddling with the Die Glocke. But it proved to be a riddle that they couldn't crack despite their best efforts. Phillips, who seemed to have a better understanding of how the device might work in concept, was fiddling with the knobs, but found that he couldn't change the dates again. They appeared to be locked into the current setting, and he couldn't understand why. Across the fire from them, lying on its belly with its head on the ground, was the hybrid. Its glowing eyes were staring at them, unblinking, until it finally spoke. Okay, you two. You've had time to collect yourselves. Now I want answers. Who are you? Phillips and Bride turned their wary gazes up to the hybrid sitting across the fire from them. Where are you from? Version 2 added with some agitation in his voice. Are you from another community? Are you just living on the road? Bride gulped. We're really from 1945. This morning we were in Poland. Now we're suddenly in Ohio. Just like that. It's as crazy as it sounds, I admit, he insisted. I don't know how to make you believe it, but... He trailed off and seemed to get an idea. Look at what we're wearing. Look at our weapons. Have you ever seen a rifle like this? And the uniforms. Does anyone in 2045 walk around wearing World War II uniforms? For us, this morning it was April 1945, not July 2045. This thing is why we're here, Bride motioned to the Die Glocke. We were trying to stop some bad people from using it to change the course of history. We we'd heard rumors about this device. It's called the Die Glocke. Rumor had it that it was a time machine. So we couldn't let it stay in the hands of those who had it if it was real. The ramifications would have been devastating. One thing led to another, and here we are in July 2045. He shook his head like he still couldn't believe it. He felt like he'd gone insane. He was sitting in a crumbling warehouse just over 100 years into the future, having a conversation with what might as well have been a monster. A monster apparently created by humans that looked like it was one of the terrible lizards he knew from books. Though, one unlike anything he'd ever imagined before. Version 2 finally snorted and lifted his head off the ground. Okay, what are your names? Still not believing that they were having a casual conversation with the hybrid, it was such a crazy thing, Bride answered nonetheless. I'm John Bride, and this is William Phillips. Sailors of the United States Navy, enlisted on December 7th, 1941. He paused and licked his dry lips. What about you? Do you have a name? Version 2, the hybrid answered. Phillips looked up from the Die Glocke and stopped tinkering with it. What does that mean? It's the only name the people who created me gave me because it's what I was. Literally a second version of an earlier hybrid, Version 2 answered. Phillips and Bride both looked lost. More lost, anyway. And Version 2 decided to humor them and fill in some of the blanks. The hybrid dinosaur sat up and stared at the two across the fire and continued. I still want answers from you two, but I'll fill you in on my story. Version 2 paused for a moment, then spoke again, his single row of teeth in each jaw glinting brightly in the flickering firelight. The group who created me sprung up very quickly after the apocalypse struck. They walled off a section of a city and maintained the power grid. They created me and other hybrids in the following years, and when they tried to force other groups to submit to and serve them through force, a conflict broke out. The communities they tried to subjugate formed a united coalition and fought back. My creators wanted intelligent but lethal animals they could use as weapons. That's why I have all this armor, all these natural weapons all over my body. I was built specifically to look scary and be lethal to anything in combat. One hybrid, version 1, though he doesn't actually call himself that, went rogue and ended up on the side of the communities our creators were fighting. I was a literal updated version of him. They made me specifically to have more strength, have more lethality, have more weapons on my body. I found out later that they were obsessed with making me an improvement to him in every way, because after his escape, they saw him as a failure. Then, to make sure I couldn't go rogue and switch sides too, they brainwashed me into believing I should only serve them and wanted to spill blood for them. Version 1 snapped me out of the brainwashed mind they'd programmed into me as it was all winding down. And I switched sides for the rest of the war. Eventually, the community my creators were in charge of were forced to surrender when the coalition of communities they molested were essentially beating down their gates and walls. It's over now, has been for years. The communities my creators tried to subjugate won the war. The leaders who were trying to conquer the other groups were either ousted from power, jailed, or executed, depending on what their role in the war was. Version 2 explained. Phillips and Bride both still looked lost. A war between communities of people? What happened to the states? It didn't even sound like something on the scale of the Civil War. It didn't make sense to them, but Version 2 had confirmed their fears that some apocalyptic event had occurred, even though they still didn't know how it happened. Bride finally cracked and asked them, Look, you've got to explain how all this came to happen, Bride said, motioning to the air around him for emphasis. And how the hell can you talk? Phillips added. As he spoke, Version 2's blank, glowing eyes turned to face him. his gaze unblinking in the flickering firelight. Version 2 nodded. Look, you two say you're from World War II. I'm vaguely aware of that at best. But sure, you came from 1945. I'll believe you for now and assume you really don't know, because if you are faking it, then you're putting on a good act. I don't know for sure how it all happened. The apocalypse hit before I was created, a little under 10 years ago. But from people in the community I know and call friends who lived through it, said it was caused by something people only called the anomaly. The anomaly apparently spread around the Earth. No one knows how, no one knows where it came from. And because scientists couldn't explain it, it just got the name anomaly. But it resurrected every extinct animal that ever lived. Dinosaurs, more ancient animals, animals from the last ice age, all of them. That's why me, and version 1 as well, are such a mix of creatures. I look like a dinosaur. I have the claws of a Utahraptor, the spikes of a Stegosaurus. But my armor comes from the fish Dunkleosteus. My teeth are from the shark-like fish Adestus. The fact I can unhinge my jaw is a carryover from Titanoboa, and so on. Phillips and Bride took version 2's summarized explanation in. It was so much to understand. It sounded like what a Wunderwaffe would do. In some ways, version 2 was also a Wunderwaffe, just one that was built by a new regime of evil people who took advantage of a world without states and countries and powers. They still looked lost. They were clearly overwhelmed by everything washing over them the way it did, even with the explanation. But how is there even an explanation? Phillips was the one to ask. Okay, fine. But one thing you haven't addressed. How can you talk? He said. You're acting like it's the most normal thing ever, but it's not. It's what my creators wanted when they designed me and the other hybrids. They wanted animals as intelligent as people, and they made sure that's what they made. They used some genetics from what they called the variants. The anomaly didn't just resurrect every extinct animal that ever lived in the way they originally lived. It also created rare variants among them. Some that were bigger, some that were more aggressive, some that were smarter, and so on. They used some of those specimens to give us the intelligence they wanted and to give us the ability to speak, version 2 explained. Bride shook his head and finally spoke. Damn, he said, rubbing his neck, which still adorned the rope mark from when the Nazis tried to hang him and Phillips. It was so crazy for him to think that, even though it was over a century before, for him and Phillips, that had happened, along with their attempt to stop the gold train, around 24 hours earlier. It had been a long day, but a fast century. They sound just like the people we were fighting. Bride looked up at version 2, a look of acceptance filling his eyes. The people who created you. They sound just like the people we were fighting, experimenting, trying to force other groups of people under their flag, just like Germany and Japan. Look, we really are from 1945. We really are from World War II. We were fighting the Nazis. They wanted to use the Die Glocke to change the outcome of the war. Well, that's what we guessed. It's the only reason they would use it. This morning, for us, we were fighting them, and we drove through a damn hole in space and time. A hole that thing made. He pointed at the bell-shaped device Phillips was holding. And I don't know how it works, or how we'll get home. You know, even though we've never seen actual combat at any point in the war, we've still been through it. Thrown as guinea pigs without warning onto the aftermath of an experiment that drove people into homicidal rages. on a patrol boat that sank off the coast of Alaska, hanged by the Nazis, had to hijack a damn train filled with stolen art, and now time travel. Bride trailed off. Because of a device that a day ago was nothing more than a rumor to us. Phillips finished, holding the Die Glocke up. But it was real, this whole time. And here we are. This thing is the reason we're here. The rumors we first heard a year ago about it made it sound like it was huge. 12 feet tall, but apparently it's not. It's not even the size of a church bell. But it still works, all the same. Version 2 eyed them for a few more seconds. Then he nodded. I believe you, he conceded. He didn't understand how it was possible, but he believed them. The device looked very primitive compared to the technology he'd seen in the labs where he was made. The rifles Phillips and Bride had also looked very old compared to the ones he saw in the community daily. Listen, you two are in over your head. You have no idea what's out there. People in the community I'm from will look at books about prehistoric animals from around the time you two are from and laugh at how wrong it all is. You don't have any experience surviving in the world you've ended up in. So, I'll stick around and help you two out until you can figure out how to get home. Also, just so I can keep an eye on you. It wasn't an offer version 2 was making. Phillips and Bride knew it was a statement. But unlike when someone like General Aaron Moore made a statement to them that was actually an order, there was no malice hidden behind the words coming from the hybrid dinosaur. Ultimately, Phillips and Bride silently accepted that he would be sticking around. Version 2 continued to stare at the two for a little while, before he tucked his head to the side and finally went to sleep, his glowing eyes closing. He at least seemed to have fallen asleep. Phillips and Bride accepted that he was staying around and decided not to focus on his presence. Instead, they went back to talking about the Die Glocke. Bride sat closer to Phillips as he flipped the Die Glocke upside down and pointed out the details on the base, where the controls were. Okay, setting a date and location seems to be easy. You just turn these knobs and dials on the bottom, and these counters above just tally them out, Phillips exclaimed. But doing that doesn't seem to open a time portal on its own. There's got to be another step to it. But the dates also won't change. No matter how much I turn the knobs, the dates are just locked. The tally counters won't turn. I don't know what these words above the dates are, do you? Phillips asked. Bride shook his head. Just the word anchor. Phillips looked confused. Anchor? What the hell does that mean? He shook his head. Okay, forget that for now. There's also this, he said, spinning a dial that ran along the entire outer base of the bell. I don't know what purpose it serves, but it's got an arrow in one spot, so I guess you have to point it at something? I don't know. I don't know what it's for. He spun it all the way back around and stopped once it was back at the place the Nazi colonel had set it. The dial made a grinding-like sound as it spun around the metal frame. You have any idea what the purpose of it is? Phillips asked. Bride shook his head, as lost as his friend was when it came to the inner workings of the Die Glocke. Phillips sighed and set the Die Glocke down between him and Bride. Look, we're not going to figure this out tonight. We're tired. We haven't slept in 48 hours now. We're still banged up from our adventure last night, and I don't know about you, John, but I'm in so much pain I feel like I'm going to collapse. So let's get some sleep and readdress in the morning. I won't fight you on that, Bride conceded with a nod. We might need a few days just to get back up to speed, Phillips said. Something somewhere outside suddenly roared. The sound filled the warehouse before fading away. Phillips and Bride both had their hands on their rifles before the sound faded away. Once they didn't hear it again, Bride gulped. What do you think is out there? A lot we don't know about, Phillips replied. He turned to face Bride and spoke with a serious tone. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what state the world is in. We need to not attract attention and figure out how this thing works. You and I are going to get home, but we need to be quiet and keep our heads down. Bride nodded and looked across the fire at version 2. He eyed the shark-like teeth glinting in the hybrid's mouth. Due to their position, he couldn't fully close his mouth, so the large teeth were always visible. I hope he doesn't decide to just eat us tonight, Bride said. Phillips nodded. Me too. He then said, "How many bullets do you have left?" Bride checked his rifle. Less than a full clip. All our replacements were also in the Jeep. Yeah, I have a full one, but that's it, Phillips said. Well, not a full one anymore once I slide a bullet into the chamber again, he added, doing just that. It slid in with a click. So, less than a dozen bullets between us, Bride asked. I also have this, Phillips replied, pulling out the Hitler Youth knife from his belt. Yeah, I have one too, Bride replied, feeling his belt, only to realize the knife wasn't there. He patted his whole belt down and then groaned. Oh, no, I don't. I never attached it to my belt when our friends in the village gave it to us. It's still in the Jeep. Okay, don't panic. We can go back to the road tomorrow and get those rifles the Germans threw out of the vehicle. It'll be more bullets anyway, Phillips assured. Bride sighed but nodded. Liking the idea. I'll do that tomorrow. I was going to go out and try to find some food. We haven't had any since this morning. And also get an idea of the area too. And what might be in it. I'll grab them on my way back or get them on a separate run. Okay. I'll use the time to sit and have a real close look at the Die Glocke. Maybe I have to turn the knobs in a specific order to unlock the tally counters or something, Phillips said. With that plan in mind, the two exhausted sailors laid down and quickly fell asleep. The next morning, birds were squawking in the sky, but when Bride looked out of the hole in the wall, he saw that they were actually small pterosaurs. Unlike the illustrations he'd always seen of pterosaurs, like pterodactyl, these ones were covered in what almost looked like fur rather than naked, scaly skin. He remembered what version 2 had said the night before, that everything in their books from the 1940s were wrong. The one he had read was from the 1910s, meaning it was likely even more outdated. Speaking of version 2, the hybrid was awake and watching them, answering the occasional question the two asked him, but it seemed like he preferred to remain silent. Bride sighed and walked to where the smoking remains of the campfire were and grabbed his rifle off the ground. Version 2 looked over at him. I'm going to go look out for something to eat, Bride explained, and to get an idea of what all's around us. We're kind of blind in here. Who knows what else is living in the area. Hey, be careful, Phillips said from next to the remains of the fire. Bride nodded. I will be, he assured, looking back at version 2. Version 2 stared at him for a moment, his quills rising slightly at Bride's comment. Then he stood up on his hind legs. I'll come with you. Bride gulped nervously as version 2 stared at him, but resigned himself to the fact the hybrid dinosaur would be accompanying him, with a hesitant nod. Bride and version 2 crossed the clearing outside of the warehouse and soon entered the forest. In the sky above them, he saw not only familiar birds, but more pterosaurs and giant insects flying around. One large dragonfly even knocked a bird out of the sky. Bride paused and looked up to watch in a bit of astonishment, but version 2 lifted a hand and gently pushed him forward. Keep moving, don't stop out in the open. In the forest, Bride felt layers of leaves and sticks crunch under his boots. He held his rifle slackly in front of him, but at the ready for quick use. The forest seemed clear of animals for the time being. He looked back over his shoulder at version 2, who was following a few steps behind him down on all fours. He turned away from the hybrid dinosaur and proceeded forward. The sound of something squawking made him whip around and raise the rifle, but he didn't see anything. Though his hands were shaking, he managed to aim steadily. The feeling of having to sneak around, with the feeling of being watched or followed, and that the threat could be around any corner, brought back bad memories of his experience on the USS Eldridge. One memory that flashed through his mind was the arm creeping out of the doorway and pulling the corpse of a sailor who had attacked him back into the room with it. Bride lowered his rifle and turned away from where the noise came from and kept going. Version 2, who had stopped and also looked in the direction the sound came from, faced forward and followed the sailor after a few moments. Stay away from the edge of any river or stream you find unless I'm with you, Version 2 advised. Bride looked back over his shoulder. Why? Giant crocodiles, large predatory fish, dangerous amphibians, giant carnivorous aquatic reptiles, Version 2 replied. Bride instinctively tightened the grip on his gun and faced forward again. Oh, great, he shuddered. Anything else I should know about? Bride asked. Lots, Version 2 replied. Prehistoric mammals that could be 10 feet away from you and you would not see them. Dinosaurs unlike anything you can imagine. Snakes longer than you, me, and your friend would be if we all laid down nose to tail. Animals that would look alien to you. Need I continue? No, Bride replied. They crossed through the wood quickly and came back out into the overgrown neighborhood. The houses stood tall above him, still recognizable despite the thick vines covering them. A small primate of some kind climbed out of the window of one and jumped across to another and scampered inside. Bride stayed up at the window for a few moments and Version 2 came up behind him. Gaudanosha, a genus of solitary primates that originally lived around 49 million years ago, he explained. Bride looked over at him. How the hell do you know that? Version 2 turned to face him, his Adestus teeth coming a little too close to Bride's face for his liking. The lead scientist who created me knew just about every extinct animal and tested on so many of them. Bride took a step back. So, what is an Adestus then? I never heard of that one either. A shark-like fish that got around 30 or so feet long. One of the species is where my teeth come from. It lived 300 million years ago, give or take, Version 2 said, holding his jaws partially open for a moment so Bride could get a good look at his teeth. I don't know which species they're from, but they're all referred to as scissor-toothed sharks. My creator specifically wanted me to have their teeth because he thought it made me look scarier. That's the kind of thing he cared about. He was the definition of what people called a mad scientist. Scarier? How the hell does that work? Bride asked. Adestus means to devour. So he thought giving me teeth from them would make me scarier to people. That was the way he thought, Version 2 answered. Deciding he'd heard enough nightmare invitations, Bride turned away from Version 2 and went back to scanning the houses. He spotted a cart lying on its side by one of the abandoned cars, which had its back hatch open and rotting suitcases in the back. He slung his weapon over his shoulder and approached, standing the cart up after dumping out what was left of the original contents, and tested its wheels out. When it rolled, shakily, but rolled, he left it where it was and approached one of the nearest homes that wasn't fully covered in vines. Version 2 watched him, but waited on the street as Bride entered the house. His nose told him nothing dangerous was in the house, so he'd let the sailor come to grips with everything on his own. The hybrid remained standing on all fours, tail swaying, as Bride stepped onto the porch. Weapon now held up, Bride stepped inside the dilapidated home. The inside looked like a bomb had gone off. Around the door, the outer casing of the walls was all collapsed, leaving only the frame. Further inside, away from the door, the more intact things became. The original white paint was even still on some of the walls further into the interior. Bride went to what he recognized as a kitchen first, but the dusty cupboards were all long empty. Instead of leaving, he decided to investigate more of the rooms. Maybe something would have been missed and left behind. He passed several rooms, seeing multiple pieces of technology that he didn't recognize on the way. He entered a child's bedroom with a dusty but made bed on one wall to the left of the door. Entering the room, Bride now slung his rifle again and picked up something off one table that he didn't recognize. A small, dust-covered flat device with a glass screen and round button on the front. Pushing it resulted in nothing happening. Not knowing what to make of the object, Bride dropped it back on the table and looked around the room again. He went to the window and looked out of it, pulling the dusty curtains back. The glass was fogged and dirty, and the vines blocked most of the view of the outside. But Bride could see trees, some he recognized and some he didn't. There was also a picnic table on the ground outside. He closed the curtain and scanned the room one final time. Something under the bed caught his eye and he approached it, pulling out a plastic tote of some kind from underneath it. He unclipped the lid and found it was stuffed with old blankets and 2 pillows. Compared with the others in the room, these had been relatively well shielded from acquiring much dust. Bride had slept horribly the night before, so he took the blankets and draped them over his shoulder and grabbed the pillows. If he and Phillips were going to be stuck here for an unknown amount of time, then this way they could at least be comfortable. He left the bedroom and paused while in the hallway outside, looking at the framed photos still hanging on the walls. The faded pictures, color pictures at that, showed a happy, smiling, and laughing family. In some, they were sitting at the same picnic table Bride had seen out of the window, in what he now guessed was the old backyard. In one picture, a young girl, maybe 13, was holding the same device Bride had found on the table in the bedroom. The faded image showed the device had some kind of image in the glass screen, and a wire was running out of it and up into headphones the girl was wearing. The smiling girl herself was giving a 2-finger sign at the camera that he didn't recognize. Seeing the faces of who had lived here before really made the enormity of a total collapse hit him. He just hoped that those who lived after the war, but before this mess, lived in a good world. He exited the house and walked back into the street, still draped in the thick blankets. Version 2 was waiting for him and watched him descend down the porch steps. A rabbit suddenly bolted out from under some old sheet metal laying next to the porch. Bride dropped the pillows and threw his rifle up to shoot, but when he did, he fired and missed the shot. The rabbit kept going, only to get crushed when Version 2 slammed his hand down onto it with lightning fast, but deadly efficiency. Bride paused for a moment when Version 2 looked back over at him, but the hybrid merely held up the bleeding rabbit as an offering. Bride loaded his car and placed the rabbit in the old child seat. Before going back to the warehouse, he went to the place where he and Phillips had ordered the Nazis to drop their weapons the day before. He gathered the guns up, placed them in the cart too, and slid the colonel's pistol into his own empty holster. His own had been taken when he and Phillips were captured and nearly hung to death by the Nazis. The pistol the colonel had dropped was a Walther PPK semi-automatic, and it was fully loaded. Bride hoped the clip would stay full. The entire time, Version 2 didn't speak. He just followed and kept an eye out for anything dangerous. They didn't see anything, but on the way back, along the same route that Bride and Phillips had took through the woods the day before, they did come across something that hadn't been there the day before. Something that deeply, deeply shook Bride when he saw it. Pressed into the dirt and fallen pine needles was a track of 3-toed footprints. Very large 3-toed footprints. And suddenly, it felt much more real and immediate to Bride that the world Version 2 had described really did exist, and his stomach felt like it dropped clear out of his body as he fearfully scanned the trees, looking for the dinosaur that had left the tracks, but he again saw nothing. That evening, Phillips used his knife to fillet the rabbit, and he and Bride cooked it on some sticks they collected. It was unorthodox, but they ate well that night, even if they felt they could have eaten more. Phillips sucked some of the flavor off one of the bones before tossing it into the fire. "Not a lot. That's one of the better meals I've had lately," he said. Bride nodded, chewing on his last bite of rabbit meat and swallowing it as well. The two had been worried about Version 2 needing food too, but he'd assured them that he didn't eat nearly as often as they might have thought he would. "Did you make any progress on the Die Glocke?" Bride asked once he'd finished eating. Philip shook his head, picking the device up. "I still can't wrap my head around what this dial does," he explained, spinning the large one that ran around the entire outer base of the Die Glocke. Well, what about the tally counters? Bride asked. Phillips again shook his head. The dates and locations are still locked no matter how much I turn the knobs. I thought it might be as easy as setting a date and time and location, and then that lightning thing would happen and open a hole, but no. There's clearly another step along the way you have to do. I just can't figure it out what it is. He set the device down and sighed. So, what'd you see out there? And aside from the rabbit. Extinct animals, Bride said. Pterosaurs, primates, big bugs. On the way back, we came across some tracks that weren't there yesterday. Big three-toed footprints. William. They looked like Allosaurus footprints. I recognized them from a book, he said, his voice shaking. Allosaurus sounded like it was one of the scariest animals Bride thought he could ever meet. The art he always saw of the animal depicted it viciously attacking and devouring other animals, dead or alive. One painting of an Allosaurus viciously ripping into the tail of a dead animal that he'd seen was seared into his mind. He'd never felt scared of dinosaurs before, when they were long dead and fun mysteries. But now he did, because they were alive and all around him. The sailors who went bananas on the USS Eldridge had been frightening, but they would be nothing to animals so big they could rip you in two with one bite. Seeing the footprints had made it feel very real to him. Hey, relax. It'll be okay. Don't lose your head, Phillips said. Bride nodded but gulped. Phillips looked at version 2. Allosaurus. Are they that vicious? Version 2 didn't answer for a moment, then he said, They're not my favorite dinosaur to get into a tangle with. Phillips put a hand to his lips and thought about that. Bride grasped his hair and shook his head, now shaking. The group didn't say much else as it slowly got dark outside. A storm rolled in after nightfall. The rain fell hard in sheets of water that dripped down off the jagged metal on the roof. Thunder shook the building and lightning danced in the sky outside. The dripping was as constant as the rainfall. Phillips and Bride's campfire was long extinguished from the dampness of the air, and the two sailors had rolled themselves up in their respective beddings they'd made from the blankets Bride had found in the house. Phillips didn't know why he had woken up, but he thought he'd heard the sound of something wet sinking into the mud outside. He sat up and looked at the hole in the wall, but saw nothing in the next flash of lightning. He laid back down a moment later. Another sound like the first came right after he did, and he sat up again. Once again, he heard the sound of something heavy setting down in the mud outside. Bride's fears about Allosaurus came back to his mind. This time, Phillips threw his blankets off and crouched next to his bedding. The third time the sound came confirmed that not only was something out there, but that the sound was actually a heavy footstep. Bride's fears might not have been unwarranted, especially if Allosaurus were as vicious as the art of them Phillips had seen indicated. With the rain outside increasing in intensity, Phillips grabbed his rifle and then shook Bride. Hey, wake up, he whispered. Bride mumbled, then opened his eyes. Huh? What? He asked. Something's outside, Phillips hissed. Bride instantly shot awake at that, threw his own blankets off, and grabbed his rifle as well. Phillips grabbed the Die Glocke, and he and Bride cautiously backed away from the open hole in the wall, staring into the night outside. Phillips set the Die Glocke down once they had space between them and the opening. He and Bride both slowly raised their weapons and waited. The only sound was of their breathing and the rain outside pouring off the roof. Aside from the rain, everything then fell quiet outside. But the two didn't take their eyes off the opening. Phillips quickly made sure his weapon was still ready to fire. Bride, meanwhile, was shaking but kept his gun aimed at the opening in the wall. A sudden flash of lightning cast a shadow on the wall. Something massive was outside, its jaws open and exposing its massive teeth. Oh God, Bride gasped. The shape of a large head appeared in the opening wall they'd been using as a door and turned to face them. They heard the sound of it sniffing. Then, its nose slowly came into view as the thing peeked its head inside of the opening. Through the dripping water, there was a large snout gleaming teeth poking out from behind bared, fleshy lips, and eyes glowing from the pale light outside. Its head turned to face them, and it paused. The thing froze and just stared at them for several seconds. It seemed to study them for a long moment with forward-facing, unblinking eyes, its gaze licking them over with predatory glare, one not too dissimilar from the one the Nazi captain had who had ordered them hanged. Then, the dinosaur, that was definitely what the two were looking at, they knew, one of the big meat-eaters to be exact, seemed to reach its conclusion about them, and it started to try to squeeze its body inside too. It had decided it had found its next meal. It opened its large jaws, bellowed, and began to shove its way inside the warehouse towards them. Phillips and Bride didn't hesitate another moment, and they both opened fire as it went to squeeze toward them. The massive dinosaur jerked back and shook its head side to side, bellowing again before continuing to shove its way into the warehouse. Despite having limited ammo, the sailors didn't stop firing, the bullets striking the theropod's snout. It shook its head side to side, opened its jaws, and bellowed, and tried to come near to them as they continued to fire, bright flashes of light spitting out of the end of their guns with each bullet fired, illuminating the face and eyes of the dinosaur in bright, vivid, horrifying detail. The bullets left bleeding wounds on its snout, but the dinosaur didn't seem to notice, and its opening jaws continued to come near to them. The metal shards hanging around the hole squeaked and creaked as the massive animal shoved more of its body inside the hole towards them. The dinosaur kept coming closer. Its jaws were open, and it was ready to snap down on them once it was in reach. Then all of a sudden, a black shape flew in from the side and latched onto the theropod's head. It bellowed, a sound that shook Phillips and Bride's bodies as it passed through them. Version 2 latched onto its head and sunk his teeth into it, the animal trying to throw him off, but when Version 2 dealt a severe slash to its eye, it pulled itself back out of the hole and into the night. Version 2 let go as it retreated and watched it go, before turning to face the two sailors. In the pitch dark of the interior of the warehouse, all Phillips and Bride could see were his blank, glowing eyes, essentially floating in the dark ahead of them. They could hear more dripping, though, but it wasn't rain dripping down from the metal roof. It was blood dripping from Version 2's claws and teeth onto the floor. The event had ended as quickly as it began, and it all happened in a matter of seconds. Phillips, admittedly feeling creeped out at the sight of Version 2's glowing eyes watching them, checked his rifle. One bullet was left. Shit, he said. The thing wouldn't stop. It ate all my ammo. How many bullets do you have left, he asked, facing Bride. Bride didn't answer. He was shaking. A moment later, he lost it and began to break down. Shaking, he sank to the ground and began sobbing and having a panic attack. What was that? What was that? We have to get home. We have to get home. We won't survive here. We're not cut out for this, he rambled. Phillips dropped his rifle and hurriedly grasped his friend's shoulders. Hey, look at me. That thing nearly ate us, Bride shouted. Phillips shook him again. John, look at me. Bride slowly did, tears still rolling down his face. Phillips shook him gently. Hey, we are going to get home. We are not going to die here. He paused, trying to think of how he could reassure his best friend, especially when he was unsure himself. Hey, it could be worse. Dinosaurs are alive again nearly a century from our day? Fine. At least we know where we are, and it's still more or less modern compared to our home. At least it's only a century that we're from home. There are plenty worse places we could have ended up. The Dark Ages. The middle of the ocean 1,000,000 years ago. What's it called? Carboniferous. The 100 Years' War. We could have ended up crashing in some Jurassic swamp and losing the Die Glocke. Or in medieval Europe or ancient Greece or Egypt and not had the tools to fix it if it's broken. It might be, it might not be, but here we can find the tools if we need them. Things that we have here that we wouldn't if we ended up anywhere else, like ancient Greece. Archimedes himself couldn't have done us any good without modern tools. Like the ones we can still find here. Another good reason we ended up where we did. Here we can fix it if it's broken. Maybe even Find some records from the 1940s about the Die Glocke. We have it. We'll figure out how it works and fix it, if we have to. You and I are going to get home. John, I will make sure we get back, he said. I promise. Bride wasn't sure what to say. He just nodded as his panic attack passed. Version 2 watched over the two the whole while, but he didn't speak. He didn't feel like he had any words that he could offer the two. Phillips finally looked over at him once Bride had mostly calmed down. What was it? That was a Tyrannosaurus, Version 2 answered. Phillips gulped. You have them around here? Them and more, Version 2 confirmed. Even after the two had fallen back into a restless sleep, he stayed awake for the rest of the night, to be sure the Tyrannosaur didn't come back. He was still awake after the sun had come back up, and the two sailors stirred from the little bit of restless sleep they had gotten. His loyal watch was noticed by Phillips. He began to regard the hybrid dinosaur with a less suspicious glare after that. That morning, as soon as the sun was fully above the trees and shining into the crumbling building, Phillips was up. He'd finally snapped and awoke seeing red. He threw his blankets off, snatched up his rifle, and stormed towards the hole in the wall, sliding a bullet into the chamber of his rifle. Version 2's head snapped up at Phillips as he stomped towards the hole, and he sat up. Hey, where are you going? Phillips didn't look back. He just walked out of the hole, a vengeful glare in his eyes. Version 2 followed him to the entrance, but paused there. The hybrid dinosaur growled softly, but looking back at Bride's still sleeping form, who seemed to have finally fallen into some kind of fitful sleep. He shook his head. He couldn't leave the sleeping sailor to chase the one who had seemingly lost it. Frustrated, Version 2 looked back and watched Phillips storm off across the meadow and into the woods. In a fit, Phillips shoved his way through the forest, making as much noise as he could, until he found the fresh tracks in the mud that seemed to have been left by the Tyrannosaur. He snapped his rifle's safety off and marched after the dinosaur, the traces it left easy to follow in the bright glare of the morning sun. Around him, the leaves dripped dew and rainwater onto the ground. Phillips followed the tracks, ignoring the distant squawks and sounds of small animals rustling in the undergrowth, until he came to a clearing. He stopped. Standing in the center of the clearing, leaning down over a fresh kill, it was ripping strips of meat off the long tail of some dead animal, was a T-Rex with the telltale signs of bullet wounds on its snout. He'd found it. Still only seeing red, now even more so that he'd found his target, Phillips stormed out of the tree line and marched towards the dinosaur, raising his rifle and aiming at the animal's head. As he stormed forward and raised the rifle, the Tyrannosaur suddenly swung its head around and snapped its unblinking gaze onto the sailor. And just like that, all the anger-fueled courage he'd had melted away, and Phillips was left with only a cold chill of dread. The stupidity of what he had done now hit him. Blood dripping from its lips and lower jaw, the Rex stepped away from its kill and began to walk slowly towards him with a low growl. And Phillips found that, at the sight of it coming towards him, he was unable to squeeze the trigger of his rifle. He saw now just how feeble the bullets had been on the animal the night before. He began to back up, the Rex's eyes on him and keeping him in its gaze. But then he tripped and tumbled onto his back. He sat up in time for the Rex to reach him. He tried to crawl back, but the dinosaur was already on him. The Tyrannosaur loomed high over him and leaned down towards him. Phillips found himself nose to snout with it. Its eyes were so close he could clearly see his terrified reflection in its gaze. This close and in full daylight, the true, sheer size of the Tyrannosaurus Rex truly came into view. Last night, he couldn't comprehend it in the dark, but now he could. The animal was massive, its body was robust and bulky, its tail didn't drag on the ground as art always showed it did. Its scales were light brown, tan color, and it was almost chubby in its midsection. But it was also a powerful, dangerous carnivore, and Phillips had no doubt that there was terrifying power contained within the massive dinosaur's bulky body. The animal stared back at him, and he expected at any moment for the predator to pounce. The ones he'd met in 1945 had never wasted an opportunity. Phillips knew that at any moment he would see it open its maw and sink its teeth into him. His stupid, anger-fueled outburst was about to cost him his life. He just stared back as the animal looked at him and waited. The Rex never attacked. It stared at him, judged him, and seemed to decide it didn't see him as a threat to its easier meal because it stood back up with a snort and turned away, walking back to its kill and continuing to feed off of it. It hadn't attacked. Phillips watched it go and then sank to the ground with a sigh. He hadn't expected that. After his experiences on the Elderidge and in Poland, he never expected the predator stalking him to not attack him. In the daylight, with easier food at its disposal, the T-Rex no longer had that gleam in its eyes as it had had the night before. It was still a predator, but it was different than the ones who had ordered him hung, or the ones who he'd chased a century into the future. There wasn't hate or malice in the dinosaur's eyes like there were in the Nazis. Unlike so many of the people he had met, even though it looked like one, the dinosaur wasn't a monster. After a minute, Phillips pulled himself to his feet and grabbed his rifle. After seeing that, he no longer felt hatred towards the animal and turned to let it be. He saw version 2 standing in the tree line, staring at him. Phillips made eye contact with the hybrid dinosaur, who merely nodded and motioned him to follow him back to the warehouse. He sank down onto all fours and waited for Phillips to catch up, deciding he'd had to take a chance at leaving Bright alone so the other sailor didn't get himself killed. But what he had found was Phillips seemingly making some self-discovery. As Phillips caught up to him and he and version 2 walked back to the warehouse side by side, version 2 hoped that the experience would keep the sailor from storming off again for some grand last stand. "Are you okay?" version 2 eventually asked, standing up on his hind legs again and looking down at Phillips. Phillips stopped and looked up at him. He nodded. "I've got a lot to think about," he said. He and version 2 then continued their walk back to the warehouse. After discovering a hidden stash of weapons in a barricaded, windowless backroom of a store, all makes and designs that they didn't recognize, but figured out how to load and fire, the werewolf unit, along with Woremann, left the Volkswagen stashed away and hidden, and proceeded to explore the area on foot. They spent an afternoon learning how to shoot their new weapons. The designs of some were similar to ones they knew, but the makes were not, using old cans as targets while getting a feel for them. They were awed at their effectiveness. Woremann had even proved to be a lethal shot with only a mere pistol he'd found in the stash, and his werewolf unit had quickly learned to shoot their own newly found automatic weapons with deadly accuracy as well. Now that they had practiced with them for a few days and were ready to use them, they set out to explore on foot. They didn't take the Volkswagen. They needed the gas still in their vehicle to last. They couldn't risk running out before they got their hands back on the Die Glocke. Woremann wasn't in a big rush. He knew the Americans couldn't work the Die Glocke. That was why he'd ordered the group to leave without making a move to get it back. Now, they were armed with automatic weapons that seemed to be much more improved and slicker from the ones they recognized in the German arsenal. Their clips held 20 bullets each, and the gun would constantly fire until empty if one held the trigger down. Woremann knew that the American trooper had spun the date on the Die Glocke to a random one. He wanted to learn where and when exactly they were. The look and feel of the automatic rifles and the styles of cars that were much nicer, even as ruins, made him believe they were in the future at some point, but when, he didn't know. Nor did he know what had happened to cause the world to end up in the state it was in. So, armed with plenty of ammunition that they'd also found in the stash, they were patrolling on foot, looking for clues. The lethality of the weapons gave them confidence that they would handle any threat they came across as they explored a desolate street without making any attempt to stay hidden. Leading the group down the street, Woremann, the only one not armed with one of the automatic rifles, just with a pistol he had jammed into his holster to replace the one he'd thrown away, the same one he'd practiced shooting with, put a hand up to make the unit stop behind him. He heard laughter. They were on a street in a dilapidated town, and the voices, and smell of smoke, were coming out of a large shattered window of a storefront. Walking forward, Woremann peeked inside. A group of 6 or so people sat inside the building, at the end of one of the rows of empty shelves. They were laughing with each other. Despite the shattered building around them and the ruined world they were living in, a world without much needed order, they seemed to be making the best of it and surviving just fine, like a tribe of primitive man in Africa millions of years earlier. Woremann regarded them, his gaze unreadable and expressionless. Then, he slipped back from the shattered window and nodded to his unit of troops. They readied their automatic rifles and then, shouting in German, rushed into the doorway. Woremann followed as the werewolf unit surrounded the startled group, shouting at them to put their hands up. Though the group couldn't understand what they were saying, they did put their hands up due to having so many weapons pointed at them. Woremann stepped between the soldiers and gazed with a slight sneer at the people cowering at their feet. They gazed back at his immaculate figure, his striped medals, his neat hair poking out from under his visor, his crisp uniform and straight posture. The confused survivors gazed back at him, looking terrified because only someone, or in this case a group, who were completely insane would be wandering around nearly a decade into the apocalypse dressed like a Nazi commander and his soldiers from 100 years earlier. What kind of people did that? No one sane or good, that was for sure. As Woremann gazed down at the couples, the group of 6 seemed to be made up of 3 of them, the husband of the nearest one to him spoke up. "What the hell are you cosplaying as Nazis for?" he asked. His wife looked over at him. "Don't," she hissed. "The kind of people who would do that are absolutely insane." She looked at Woremann. "Just take whatever you want, please." Woremann continued to stare at the group for a few moments, his unit holding them at gunpoint all the while. "What year is it?" Woremann finally asked in English, standing up straight with his hands behind his back. "What?" The confused man closest to Woremann asked. "What year is it?" Woremann demanded again, shouting now and shaking from frustration. The confused man at his feet didn't answer, looking completely lost. So Woremann pulled his pistol out, flicked the safety off, and fired a bullet into the man's wife. The other survivors screamed, and the man fell forward when it happened. Woremann didn't twitch. His cold eyes didn't blink. He calmed himself, and his cool, strong display of emotionless coldness returned. He holstered his pistol. "What year is it?" he said again. What? It's 2045. What's wrong with you?" the now sobbing man shouted. "What's wrong with you? Why'd you shoot her? Why are you dressed like a Nazi? What's wrong with you? Are you insane?" He tried to crawl to the body, but a werewolf struck his head with his rifle, shouting at him not to move. Now sobbing, the man lay on the floor at Vormann's feet, sounding broken. Woremann didn't answer his question or look at him. He merely looked up and said softly, 2045. A century into the future. The world was in shambles, ruins, and clearly in need of stewards to steer it on the right path. Vormann's resolve was only more determined than ever to change the outcome of June 6, 1944. He looked back at the group. "Season?" he asked. "It's summer," one woman near the back of the group answered, just giving the madman what he wanted. Woremann looked at her. "And how did this happen?" "What?" the woman asked. Woremann gestured around. All of this. Um, the anomaly? The woman offered. Vorman's silence prompted her to continue. The thing that resurrected all the extinct animals that ever lived in prehistory? She offered, not knowing what this man wanted to hear. He should know this already. It caused anarchy, destroyed food chains, caused civilization to collapse. Explain this anomaly, Woremann demanded next. The girl shook her head. We don't know. How did it happen? Woremann prompted. We don't know, but the world, none of the governments can handle it, she said. Woremann took that in. Around a century in the future, the civilized world would be destroyed by an apocalypse he now knew the catalyst of. Only a strong, world-dominating regime could be prepared to tackle this anomaly when it finally happened. A century was plenty of time to prepare if someone was leading the world under one banner to get ready for it, and have only the best ready to tackle its effects on civilization. Woremann only was now more convinced than ever that he must return to May 1944, to tell Hitler of the coming invasion, to give them time to make it right. This glimpse of the future only gave him a more fanatic drive to complete his self-assigned mission. And to do that, he knew he must track the two Americans down. Woremann turned his cold gaze away from the group and faced his werewolf unit, and softly ordered something in German. He then walked back out of the old store as his men stomped past him, raised their weapons, and fired into the group until they stopped moving. Woremann did not look back. His decision to kill the small group of survivors was not personally motivated. He simply felt that, at the moment, it was better to have no witnesses to their presence be left behind at all. If the Americans learned of their presence still being in the area, it might complicate matters. And that was what they needed to do now. To get the plan back on track, to not just win the war, but also get the world ready for this great cataclysm when it occurred. Woremann knew that the Americans couldn't have figured out how to work the Die Glocke. That was the reason he had backed off so easily when the Americans ordered them to leave upon first arriving in 2045. Well, part of that was also a state of shock at seeing the world and civilization completely gone on their initial arrival, but also because he knew they would not be able to use the device without a vehicle to get it up to the speed it needed for the jump in time to happen. The Die Glocke couldn't be used sitting still. It needed to be in a vehicle and driven up to a certain speed for it to work. Upon seeing the state of the world upon their arrival, he felt confident that there were none anywhere, and handing it over for the time being would be the smarter move, considering the Americans had them at gunpoint. Woremann stepped out onto the street and gazed down the empty town. Once he did his work. Once he corrected many mistakes. This future would never come to pass. That state of shock, of completely being unable to comprehend what one was seeing, that they'd felt upon their arrival, would never be felt by anyone again. Woremann was more determined than ever to change the war's outcome now. He just needed the Die Glocke back. As his equally insane werewolves joined him on the street, Woremann said to them, "We have to find the Americans." That morning, things at the warehouse were glum and dispirited. While Phillips found he'd handled the events from a few nights before overall well, Bride had not. He'd not slept for more than a few restless minutes at a time over the entire last few days, paranoid about what else might come for them. He finally had fallen into a deep sleep once the sun was up that morning, and Phillips didn't want to wake him. Maybe Bride was more panicked after the attack because he knew more about the terrible lizards than he did. Phillips didn't know if ignorance was a good shield to have in this instance, but it was good that one of them was keeping it together. Phillips had spent a few days since the attack trying to get a better understanding of the Die Glocke, but he'd not gotten any closer to figuring out how it worked. The few days had been nice for one thing. The two had subsequently recovered from several of their injuries. Many of their bruises were healing up. Phillips found his gunshot wound did not hurt nearly as bad anymore, and the sore rings on their necks the ropes had left were fading away too. However, their wounds healing up were not encouraging when the Die Glocke was still nothing more than a bell-shaped paperweight. But what they needed now was food. Phillips sighed and grabbed one of the rifles once the sun shone a beam into the warehouse. Version 2 looked at him. "I'm gonna go hunt for food," Phillips said, sliding a bullet into the chamber with a click. "I can go," Version 2 offered. "I'd feel better if you were here with him," Phillips said after a moment. He did. He had no doubts that the hybrid could protect his exhausted friend better than he could himself, even with a gun. Version 2 didn't respond for a moment. Then he nodded. "I won't let him out of my sight," the hybrid dinosaur promised. Phillips nodded. "Thanks," he said, looking like he wanted to add more to that, but instead, he just picked his weapon up and stood up. Taking a moment to practice aiming with the German-designed rifle, once he felt comfortable with his grip on it, he lowered it and walked towards the exit of the warehouse. Version 2 noted that Phillips was no longer casting him a sideways, suspicious glance when he thought he wasn't looking back. As Phillips walked out of the hole in the wall, climbed over the collapsed metal, and outside of the warehouse, he stopped. His jaw fell slack, and the gun he was holding fell limp in his grasp. Grazing in the meadow across from the warehouse was a herd of stegosaurus. And they were beautiful. The large animals were moving slowly, their spiked tails lazily swinging. They also looked nothing like what he'd pictured. Version 2 had been right. The illustrations in the books from the 1940s and before were very inaccurate to how they really appeared. The heads were too small, the backs were too humped, and they didn't hold a candle to how majestic the dinosaurs appeared in real life. In reality, the Stegosaurus had a long tail that didn't drag on the ground, but was instead held high above it. Its back was adorned with colorful plates instead of the dull ones Phillips had always seen in illustrations. Its hide looked strong, and the muscles beneath rippled with each step the grazing dinosaurs took. Its neck was longer than it appeared in the art he'd seen, and its posture was straight and upright. It was nothing like the art he'd seen of them in the books. The dinosaurs grazed, not minding him, not acting hostile, not doing evil like so many people in the world he'd left a century in the past did. It was beautiful. Phillips even felt a tear sliding down his cheek. There was, despite everything he and Bright had seen, both in their time and the current present, still some beauty, some peace, and some good in the world nonetheless. It wasn't snuffed out. It was a nice feeling. After watching for a few minutes, Phillips readjusted his grip on the rifle and set off. The sailor strolled between the stegosaurs, but they didn't pay him any mind or act aggressive towards him. He gave them plenty of space, though. He quickly crossed the meadow and entered the forest. Eleptictidium scampered into its hiding place as Phillips made his way through the woods, rifle raised but not aimed at anything in particular. Phillips was following some deer tracks. They looked fresh. He followed the path the deer had taken and slowly came to a stop when he found it. The deer was lying next to a tree, all of its meat freshly stripped from its bones. Phillips approached cautiously, holding his gun up. When he got closer, he could see large bite and scratch marks on the spine and ribs. A few bones had even been broken from having been bitten by something. Phillips heard something nearby suddenly let out what sounded like a mix between a squawk and a bark. He looked around. The foliage on all sides prevented him from seeing anything. Tucking his gun into his shoulder, he cautiously made to back off, pointing the gun in the direction the sound had come from. He'd only just gotten to what he thought was a safe distance away when he heard another sound off to his right. Something large was pushing its way through the brush towards him, vocalizing deeply as it came nearer. Phillips went wide-eyed and looked in all directions for a moment before he ran, leaves crunching under his feet, to a large, hollowed-out rotten log that was lying on the ground. Dropping his rifle to the ground, he got on his hands and knees and crawled inside of the snug space, pausing once he was in the middle. He pressed himself down into the soft, damp ground and went completely still. Trying to keep his rapid breathing short, He didn't move, but he could hear footsteps of something walking nearer to him. Gazing out the opposite end of the log from where he'd crawled inside, he had to stifle a gasp when a leg appeared outside the opening. A foot, three-toed, scaly, with a large sickle claw on one toe, stepped down on the ground right outside of the opening of the log. Each of the three toes ended in a claw, but the other two were not nearly as large as the lethal-looking sickle. He heard the animal trilling, then it squawked. It readjusted its stance outside, but it didn't move on. It just sniffed the air. Phillips couldn't see what it was, nor was it a species he'd have even known, due it to not becoming known to paleontologists until 1989, and not being formally described until a decade after that. The dinosaur standing outside the log was an achillobator. It was a very large dromaeosaur that was 16 feet long. It was coated in a thick coat of speckled brown-red feathers everywhere, save for on its underbelly, inner legs, under its tail, lower legs, hands, and on its snout. The feathers on the arm were among the longest. As it stood outside the log, it began preening them. It was also a carnivore. As it groomed itself, Phillips couldn't see what it was doing. He just heard the large animal sniffing and chirping. Not about to be caught if it leaned down and looked inside the log, he slowly pulled his rifle forward, trying not to make any noise or draw attention to him. The achillobator stopped grooming its left arm and dropped it down. The clawed fingers sank into Phillips' view and he jerked back, fearing for a moment that the dinosaur was bending down to look inside the log. When it didn't, it had begun grooming its right arm. He continued, pulling his gun up, and very slowly he tucked it into his shoulder. He then brought the barrel up and aimed at the other end of the log. It would be an easy shot if he had to open fire. But he didn't have to. The raptor suddenly took off on its own and was gone. Phillips sighed and let the gun fall forward as he relaxed, the fear and tension leaving his body once the dinosaur was gone. That had been far too close for comfort. He laid inside the log for a few minutes to calm down. Then he slowly began to crawl out of it. As he emerged, he again froze because he heard something rumbling deeply behind him. Still lying on his stomach, Phillips slowly turned and looked over his shoulder and felt everything go numb at what he saw. He was looking at an unbelievably massive animal. It was hard to comprehend its size. It was a huge, long-necked dinosaur with a beak, yellow eyes, and a small head. It stood on two legs, and contrary to all the art of the terrible lizard Phillips had ever seen, this one was covered in a coat of feathers instead of having scaly skin. They were long and brown with gray speckled, and covered the entire body except for its head and undersides. The most striking thing about the dinosaur, however, was that it had long arms, and at the end of each of its 3 fingers was a very long claw, almost like a scythe. Like the achillobator, it was a species that Phillips didn't recognize, not that he knew much about dinosaurs anyway, but even if he did, he wouldn't have recognized the animal. The Therizinosaurus would not be discovered until the 1950s, and even then, it was first thought to be a big turtle and not a dinosaur. It wouldn't be until the 1970s when the animal was first suggested to even be a dinosaur. The large dinosaur was grazing on the leaves of a tree when Phillips crawled out of the log, and his movement caused it to whip its head around and gaze at him. It looked at him as he stared back, and it grumbled deeply, clicking its beak a few times. Then it began to stalk closer to him. The sight of it creeping closer to him caused his stomach to drop out of his numb body. He was frozen, unable to do anything, as the massive animal walked closer to him, gazing down at him the whole time. Even with his gun right next to him, he was unable to get himself to lift it up and fire. The sight of such an impossibly huge animal so close left him paralyzed as it continued to come closer. All he could manage to do was softly say, "What the fuck is that?" The Therizinosaurus stepped over the log and bent down to sniff him, moving its head almost like a slithering snake. It rumbled deeply again. As it bent down, It reached towards the ground, and the large claws on its hands sunk into the soft ground on both sides of him, closing around him like a cage as the animal's beak came closer, closer to him. Phillips remained frozen and wide-eyed as the beak came right up to his face, mere inches from the tip of his nose. The Therizinosaur sniffed him again a few times, then bellowed right into his face, its tongue splashing him with saliva. Then it rose up and went away, walking back to the tree it had been feeding on, its feather-coated tail swaying behind it. Phillips, having no strength left from all the tension that had been in his body, gave into exhaustion and collapsed on the ground and just laid there. It wasn't lost on him, though, that just like with the T-Rex, the mystery dinosaur didn't try to kill him when it had an easy opportunity, nor even so much as attempt to hurt him. Had that been a situation where he was face to face with one of the Nazis he'd chased into the future, he knew they wouldn't have hesitated. It was really messing with his mind that humans were more monster than the things that actually looked like ones to him were. It was a long time before he got the nerve to get up and sprint back to the warehouse. Version 2 was lying down, idly pawing at the ground with one long finger claw, when Bride finally stirred and awoke. The hybrid dinosaur turned his gaze over to the frazzled sailor, who looked more dead than alive as he sat up and rubbed his eyes. He looked drained, a shell of a human, and didn't even look over at the hybrid dinosaur that had been watching over him. There was some slightly awkward silence until Version 2, normally the one somewhat reluctant to talk, spoke. "Feeling better?" he asked. Bride looked over at him, seeing the hybrid's armored spiked tail swaying as he patiently waited for an answer. Bride regarded him for a few moments before speaking. "What does that feel like?" he asked, looking at Version 2's single row of teeth. "Not being able to fully close your mouth because of how your teeth are positioned." Version 2 cocked his head to the side, either confused or bemused at the unrelated comment, and he gave off the equivalent to a shrug. "I don't really notice it," he said. Bride sighed, now asking a question that he'd been had wanted to, and one that had been eating at him for days. "If you live in a community with people, good people even, why are you out here by yourself?" Version 2 slightly parted his jaws, then he spoke again. "I enjoy alone time," he replied. There are things my creators made me do when I was still brainwashed into being a very unstable but obedient animal to them that I have a hard time with. Some of the things I did were horrible. They haunt me. Still horrify me now that my head is clear. I tore people apart because, at the time, I thought it was fun." He trailed off and gazed down for a moment, then turned his glowing eyes back up to the sailor. "But I also come out here, not just to be alone, but also to make sure the area around the community has no strangers who have wandered into the area. That's what I was doing when I first saw you two." Bride digested the dinosaur's words, understanding that feeling of trauma, though perhaps not the exact type the hybrid dealt with. Phillips might have had a better idea, due to his experience on the USS Eldridge in 1943. "What's the community like?" Bride asked. "It's walled off, self-sustaining, and has really good people there. They're the ones who beat my fanatic creators. The other hybrids they made are there too. We all eventually switched sides in the war to defeat them," Version 2 answered. "It's a good place, though? You could make a home there? 'Cause I'm starting to doubt that we can actually make the Die Glocke work," Bride admitted. Version 2 nodded in understanding. "Listen, I don't fully understand how you two got here. I don't know how that thing works. But if you can't get home, the community I'm from would be happy to take you in. They may have fought really bad people, but they know who good ones are and welcome them." especially if someone they trust, like me, can vouch for them. Bride wiped his eyes. Thanks. Thank you, he said, his voice slightly breaking as his emotions threatened to spill out. Thank you for everything since we got here. We were totally unprepared for this. You were right, so thank you. I'm happy to help, version 2 said. You two are the kind of good people we like finding, in this case, no matter when you're from. Bride shook slightly, trying not to fully break down after days of high emotional taxation, when Philip stumbled into the warehouse, tripping over the collapsed metal and falling onto his face. Bride in version 2 stood up, and Phillips rolled over and sucked in deep breath after deep breath, looking like he'd just run a mile-long sprint. Bride rushed to him and helped him sit up. What happened to you? He said. Philip shuddered. Biggest goddamn animal I've ever seen. Damn thing was bigger than that T-Rex from the other night. God. Bride helped him over to the remains of their campfire and set Phillips down. Bride grabbed Phillips's canteen off the ground, but it was empty, so he pulled his own canteen off his belt and gave his friend some water. Phillips gulped down several swallows before gasping. He shook his head. I have no idea what it was. It was never in any book you showed me, or any movie we saw together. He laid on his back. I'm sorry. I didn't catch anything. Bride set his canteen down. That's fine. Don't worry about it. I'll get something for you, version 2 said, gazing down at the two. Phillips and Bride looked up at him. You sure? You don't have to feed us, Bride said, but version 2 shook his head. No, I don't mind. Besides, it's more dangerous for either of you two to go out there. I'll be back, he said, dropping onto all fours and walking out of the hole in the wall. Bride shook his head, then turned his gaze back to Phillips and tried to help his friend sit up. Come on, let's get this rifle off you, he said, pulling the weapon over Phillips' shoulders. Outside, Woremann watched the pesky creature that had seemingly been guarding the Americans wander away. What it was, he had no idea. But he had to stop his werewolves from trying to attack simply because he doubted their weapons would do much to stop the armored animal. They waited a few minutes to make sure it wasn't coming back. Once he was satisfied, Woremann nodded to his werewolves and they approached out of sight from the hole in the wall. Then, once they were right outside, Woremann waved the werewolves inside and they burst through the hole in the warehouse wall, shouting and pointing their guns. Phillips and Bride both jumped and scampered back in surprise as the Nazis stormed into the room, shouting and gesturing with their weapons for them to get back. Bride pulled Phillips to his feet, and they did so with their hands up. The werewolves surrounded the cold campfire remains and herded the sailors away from their pile of weapons. Neither Bride or Phillips recognized the strange-looking guns they were being threatened with. They looked like no gun they'd ever seen. They knew they must have been from sometime after the war. Woremann strolled into the warehouse, his footsteps determined stomps, but also ones not in any rush. He walked in like a man who knew he had won. He pushed through his werewolves and gazed at Phillips and Bride. His face was cold, his lip slightly twitched into a sneer for a moment, before he looked at the ground and spotted the Die Glocke next to the fire pit. With a soft gasp, he strolled forward and picked it up off the floor, turning it upside down to gaze at its dials and knobs. He adjusted a few, then walked back to the middle of his troops, looking over at Phillips and Bride again. Then he spoke in English, a slight smirk on his face. You never learned how it works. Neither Phillips or Bride answered, so Woremann continued. I admire your effort, but unfortunately you could never have worked it out here, in this ruined world. Though I'm sure you guessed my motivation, and that is why you chased us in the first place and sent us all on this little adventure to 2045. Though how you learned about my plan, I don't know. No matter. With this, I will correct the mistakes that have led to our defeat in 1945. He held the Die Glocke up to his head and gazed at the two, unable to resist bragging for a few moments while he had them at last. I'm sure you also noticed that you could not change the dates, nor the locations on any of these counters. They are locked into their current settings. You see, though truly a Wunderwaffe, The Die Glocke is also very primitive. Efficiency had to be sacrificed for it to work. With more wondrous technology we will no doubt invent once we have won the war, you could perhaps alleviate the issues this one has, but as it stands, for it to work, you need an anchor point. This device can only jump to one point in time and space, and then it must go back to the date and location it left from before it can go anywhere else. The date it left from is a constant anchor point that has to be returned to before any other period or location can be traveled to. You return an instant after you left. You always will. The loops must be closed for a new one to be opened. When you make the initial jump, you will arrive at the same congruent time at your destination that you left your original departure point. But on your return, the Die Glocke will always go back to the moment it left originally. As I said, it creates a loop. Woremann now smirked widely, his cold eyes looking over the two, and he continued. All the while, his werewolves flanked him, keeping the two American sailors at gunpoint. But with that in mind, I'm sure you two are asking yourselves, how could we not return to when we left? We couldn't change the date. There are other parts of the process. You must point the arrow on the dial at the base of the Die Glocke to a specific point. Any spot is fine. That is where the opening in time will appear. A hole, punched through fourth-dimensional space like a hole puncher through paper. But what else? Speed. You must be traveling at a high speed for the device to open a hole. It needs the energy that subjugates it to punch open an opening. Once it does, you're already driving, and you can drive straight through it. That's why you two would never have gotten it to work. You need a working vehicle, and I knew there would be none in this world. Woremann smiled. Now then, I will return to 1945 from this little accident, and then I will travel to 1944, and tell all our commanders where your little invasion of Europe will truly happen. This time, it will go as it should have. And once your landing parties are repelled on Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, we will be able to divert manpower to push the Soviet Union army back. Phillips and Bride couldn't believe it. No wonder the Die Glocke seemed inanimate. The colonel was right. They couldn't have figured it out. Setting a date wouldn't just do it. It needed to be traveling at a decent speed for the device to force an opening in time to appear. Just setting a date wouldn't do it, and where the dial on the base was spun to point to was where the opening would appear once a certain speed was reached, likely only a short distance ahead of the device you were driving. It was so simple, yet impossible for them to solve in a world without vehicles. And now, this madman had it and was going to use it to terrible effect, just as they knew he would if it was real. Now that his little brag was over, Woremann approached the sailors purposefully and grabbed the pistol in Bride's holster. It seemed like he'd been about to speak when he spotted it. Woremann pulled out his Walther pistol from the holster and inspected it, before looking back at Bride. "Thank you," he said politely, walking back to the werewolves. Before Woremann could order them executed like he had the other survivors he'd found, one of his werewolves, standing guard at the entrance, shouted something. Woremann looked at the werewolf who raised the alarm and then back at the sailors. A smile spread on his face, and an especially cruel twinkle glinted in his eyes as he got a wonderful idea for what the two Americans' fates should be. Cosmic death beyond what he could imagine would suit them. One werewolf asked if he wanted them executed, but Voremann's cruel gaze gleamed, and he shook his head, answering in German, "Leave them. Once this future ceases to exist, so will they along with it." Keeping the sailors at gunpoint, the werewolves and Woremann backed off, the Die Glocke in tow. They didn't even take the sailors' weapons. They'd be long gone before they could do anything with them. Once they were outside the hole in the wall, they turned and ran for their Volkswagen. Once they'd found the Americans, they had driven in close, but shut their vehicle off and pushed it closer so that it wouldn't draw attention to themselves. Now, they all hurried and piled into the vehicle, secrecy no longer a problem. Version 2 watched them, but instead, as the Nazis were starting the vehicle, he ran to the opening in the wall. The Volkswagen sped off as he reached it, just as Phillips and Bride reached the hole as well, rifles in hand. They shoved past the dinosaur. "They have the Die Glocke! Come on, we have to catch them!" Bride said. A bolt of blue lightning, just like the one from days ago, suddenly materialized from out of nowhere and struck a spot in the air ahead of the fleeing vehicle. A mist appeared, and reality seemed to be clawed back. A doorway back to 1945 had been opened. Phillips tapped Bride on the stomach. "We have to get through before it closes," he shouted, running towards the opening as the Volkswagen sped through and out of sight. Bride followed him. Version 2, not really grasping what he was doing other than wanting to help the two, followed. The mist was closing back in, the hole was closing as they reached it, and they jumped through to the other side right as reality closed itself again. April 1945. On the other side, they saw the Volkswagen still speeding away down the road. Bride raised his rifle and fired. He kept firing and didn't stop, and right as the Volkswagen was almost out of range, a bullet struck true. The vehicle swerved, spun, then rolled, and kept rolling over and over, throwing most of the occupants from their seats until it came to rest upside down in the grass next to the road. Phillips, Bride, and Version 2 moved towards the crashed vehicle, but several of the werewolves, who had been thrown, sat up, some bleeding, but all looking more insane than ever. They shouted and began firing their strange-looking weapons, bullet after bullet. Phillips and Bride threw themselves behind some trees for cover, but Version 2 dropped onto all fours and sprinted at them. The werewolves kept shouting, but their bullets bounced right off his armor. Several tried to scamper back desperately, but Version 2 pounced on them, sinking his teeth into them, slicing others across their faces and chests with his claws. He grabbed one in his mouth and threw him into a tree where his spine audibly snapped. The ones who survived his attack tried to dig in around their overturned smoking vehicle, but Version 2 pounced on top of it and snarled at them. The few werewolves left scampered back in shock and terror and kept trying to shoot him, but it did no good. Their bullets just bounced off his armor and he launched for them, sinking his teeth into the ones who were left. From behind their tree, Phillips and Bride just watched the scene in utter shock. They now saw how lethal their friend had indeed been designed. He truly was a living weapon, and he was incredibly lethal. They could only imagine how scary he must have been when under his creator's control. He was a dinosaur that did live up to the name, Terrible Lizard. They saw Version 2 sink down onto all fours and approach the last werewolf. Snarling, he sprung forward, jaws open, and a moment later stood up on his legs, the screaming German soldier dangling by his arm from the hybrid dinosaur's jaws. Version 2 grabbed the flailing man's kicking legs with his hands to restrain his movements. Growling, Version 2 bit down viciously, and the Nazi's arm snapped off. The screaming Nazi fell to the ground and landed at the dinosaur's feet. With a gulp, Version 2 swallowed the arm, dropped back onto all fours, and crept forward with an aggressive hiss. The sobbing Nazi tried to scoot back as Version 2 sadistically poked him with one of his long finger claws. At the sight of the Nazi in front of him sobbing and pleading, Version 2 felt a smile creep onto his face, and he opened his jaws and roared, flashing his serrated teeth in the werewolf's face. Version 2 then attacked and mauled the soldier. It was over so quickly, and Version 2 stood in the grass next to the road, dripping blood from his hands and teeth. Then, one of the doors on the Volkswagen pushed open and Woremann crawled out. His hair was messy, his visor cap was gone. His medals were askew, his uniform dirty, and in his right hand he clutched his Walther pistol, and tucked under his left arm was the intact Die Glocke. Staggering, the disheveled colonel attempted to run away from the road with his prize, his coldness fading away to reveal his true, mad desperateness. He looked like he'd completely lost it. His world and plans had collapsed around him in literal seconds. Version 2 slowly climbed up onto the overturned Volkswagen and roared at the colonel. Woremann turned around to face the hybrid as it snarled at him, crouched on the upside-down vehicle on all fours, ready to spring. Woremann raised his pistol and fired at Version 2, but the bullets just bounced off his head. He crouched and then leapt at Woremann, charging at him on all fours. In desperation, Woremann kept firing, clutching the Die Glocke against his side as if to protect it, but his bullets did nothing to stop the charging hybrid dinosaur. Version 2 reached him, reared back, and sunk his teeth into Woremann's skull and shoulders with a powerful chomp. Grabbing the colonel's waist with his hands and biting down on the body in his mouth harder, Version 2 twisted and pulled his head back until Woremann's body was torn clean in half at the belly, his innards spilling out onto the ground. Version 2 threw the upper half of his body off to the side of the road and roared. A loud shriek at the sky, now standing on his hind legs, blood flying off his serrated teeth and into the air, his tail swaying in exhilaration. With the Nazis dead, Phillips and Bride came out and ran to the spot where Woremann had died. Version 2 lowered his gaze to face them as they hurried over. The Die Glocke was laying in the grass at Version 2's feet. Phillips picked it up and saw that the counters had reset. He tried turning one of the knobs to set an arrival date and gasped with exhilaration when the counter began turning. Phillips looked up at the two. "It's working again," he said. Bride sighed and looked up at Version 2. "Are you okay? That was a lot of bullets you took." Version 2 nodded. "I'm not hurt. They just bounced off." Their moment of calm was interrupted at the sound of a vehicle. The three turned and saw a German troop transport truck approaching quickly up the road. Phillips tucked the Die Glocke under his arm. "God damn it," he said. Bride raised his rifle upward and Version 2 snarled, dropping onto all fours and crouching. The back of the approaching vehicle was uncovered, and several German infantrymen were sitting in it. One near the front stood up and shouted, pointing at the two sailors. But he didn't see Version 2, who had stealthily slinked off to the side and out of sight. The man pointing at the sailors was the werewolf Phillips had knocked out of the Volkswagen before their initial jump through time. "Son of a bitch went and found reinforcements," Phillips hissed. "He must have went and found another straggler group," Bride added as the truck stopped and the Germans piled out, weapons aimed and ready. "Shit, cover!" Phillips yelled, and he and Bride turned and ran. He and Bride just managed to jump behind another patch of trees as the Nazis opened fire at them, the hail of bullets raining into the bark. Phillips and Bride sat on their knees, tucking the Die Glocke behind them. They raised their rifles and returned fire. The German soldiers took cover alongside the road, behind the rolled Volkswagen, or behind the truck they arrived in. Bride shot one as he ran for cover and the man dropped onto the ground. Phillips saw the werewolf who had led these soldiers back to where he and Bride had chased them was still up in the truck, aiming his own gun in their direction. Phillips raised his rifle towards him and fired. The werewolf jerked back, dropped his weapon, and tumbled down over the front of the vehicle and onto the ground. Phillips watched him fall before turning his attention back to the battle at hand. The Nazis were firing relentlessly and keeping the two sailors pinned down, forced to duck behind trees and not get many shots off. In lulls in the gunfire, Phillips and Bride were able to return fire, but their bullets were running low and they weren't making much progress. Then suddenly, a black shape charged into the Nazis from Phillips and Bride's left. With a shriek, Version 2 plowed into the soldiers. Several screamed in utter fear and turned their guns on him. One died when they took a direct hit from his spiked tail. Another had their guts spilled out by a swipe from his claws, and another's screams were cut off as Version 2's jaws slammed down over his head. He ran in and out of the group, carrying away bodies in his jaws before coming back and attacking anew. The Nazis kept firing, but they couldn't stop the lightning-fast force picking them off one by one. With the Nazis not even looking at them now, Phillips and Bride stood, leaned out around the trees, and began firing again. Several were struck in the back, others turned to try returning fire once they realized that they were being attacked from two sides, but taking their eyes off Version 2 was a death sentence. Nazi after Nazi died by the dinosaurs' claws, teeth, and spikes, some dying where they stood, others screaming in fear as Version 2 dragged them off the road and out of sight. Phillips and Bride continued their barrage. As Version 2 continued to attack, then ripped several Nazi soldiers apart, they shot the others. Several bullets also pelted the windshield of the truck and killed those inside it. Despite being outnumbered by more than 4-1, the two sailors in Version 2 ended the battle in mere minutes. A few Nazis tried to run, but Version 2 chased them down and mauled them until there were no more attempting to escape. The last one left had simply stared, dumbfounded, as he crept towards them on all fours, snarling. Then he'd rushed them, and their screams quickly were cut off with a crunch of bone. When it was finally over, Phillips and Bride came out from behind the trees and walked towards the truck. Version 2 met them there. Phillips ejected his spent clip and picked a full one up from a dead soldier's pocket and snapped it into his rifle. For a moment, the three didn't speak. There was a slight air of uncertainty between them, especially with version 2 now being a century into the past than he should have been. Bride finally was, again, the one who broke the awkward tension. So, now what? Phillips sighed, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and went back for the Die Glocke. He returned to the group and set the date on it for July 8th, 2045, matching the location with what it had been, and knew the return time would be less than an hour after they'd left. He looked up. "We have to send him home," Phillips said. Bride nodded. "Yeah," he agreed. "Good thing it works," Phillips said. "Imagine if it was broken," he said, looking up at version 2. "I guess I'd have had to make do," version 2 said, taking a look around the world from a century in the past. It was kind of incredible to get a glimpse of the world from, in his perspective, distant history. "Well, it doesn't matter. It works, and we'll send you home," Bride promised, looking relieved to be back. Philip shook his head, tapping the Die Glocke a few times. "Do you want to go back too?" Phillips then hesitantly asked. "What?" Bride said. "I kinda want to go back too," Phillips replied. Bride did a double take. "What?" he said. Phillips nodded. "Yeah." Bride shook his head. 10 minutes before we left, you were having a panic attack. Now you want to stay there? Listen, bad experience, yes, but on the whole, it felt like a good place, good time for a fresh start. I mean, John, what's left for us here in 1945? Our brothers are gone. That bastard Aaronmore might try to get us killed again. At least in 2045, maybe we could make a good life for ourselves. A fresh start, a completely new slate. And we have a good friend here who can help us get adjusted to it," he said, motioning to version 2. Then he added, "There's just some beauty there that I don't think I see here anymore. Yes, those animals were big and dangerous and scary, but that's different from fighting people like these guys here. Animals just do what they do. These Nazis do it all out of malice and hate because they want to hurt someone else. I don't think I want to stay here knowing somewhere seemingly better might be in reach. Plus, you saw it after the 73 sank and Aaronmore turned up. While we were looking for the train, people like this bring out the worst in me." Bride couldn't believe what he was hearing. "William, listen. You do that and come to regret it. There is no coming back. And nothing to live for? The war is almost over. It's almost done. We're not going to give up now. We have to make it count. Here. Now. This is where we belong. We won't survive in that world to be," he said. "I know the last few days, the last few months have been hard, but that's not a reason to jump ship and jump 100 years into the future. William, please listen to me," he added. Version 2 remained silent, feeling like this was something the two needed to address on their own. "William, please," Bride pleaded. "See reason. You can't go back." Philip stared at his best friend for a moment and then nodded. "Okay, you're right. We belong here," he conceded, knowing deep down that Bride was right. Bride sighed in relief. Thank you, he said. Then they turned their gazes to version 2. Philip shook the Die Glocke a little bit. Hey, big guy, when you get back, destroy this thing. Smash it, drop it in a lake. I don't care, but it has to be destroyed. Version 2 nodded. I will, he promised. Philip smiled at him. Good. You know, you're not actually so bad. Real nice to have around in a fight. He'd have been real useful on the Eldridge Bride. And sorry for shooting you when you first jumped out at us. Version 2 snorted in bemusement. It didn't hurt, he assured, dropping onto all fours so that he was closer to eye level with the two sailors. I'm glad to have met you two, he said, even if it wasn't the best introduction. Yeah, us too, Bride said, reaching out and patting version 2's armored snout. Thank you, the sailor said with a grateful smile. You really saved our skins. Several times. Phillips patted his nose as well. Thanks for not killing me, especially when I shot you, he chuckled. Bride snorted. Yeah, he could have eaten you then and there. It took a lot for me not to, version 2 said. Usually, I don't take kindly to being shot. Philip shook his head and then held up the Die Glocke. I'll get this thing in the truck, drive it until a hole appears. You just get through before it closes, he said to version 2. The hybrid nodded. Hey, I'm not the best with words, so I'm happy to say I met some good friends. Us too, Phillips assured, echoing Bride's sentiment. Unable to resist, he set the Die Glocke down and gave version 2 a hug around the neck. One of goodbye and one of thanks. Bride did the same a moment later. See you on the other side, Slick, Phillips said. Phillips got into the still-running truck, pulled the dead body of the driver out, who had been shot through the windshield, pointed the dial on the Die Glocke straight down the road, and then began driving. The Die Glocke began rattling, and the upper and lower sections began spinning. The familiar lightning bolt struck, and space and reality ahead seemed to peel back once it struck. Once it was open fully, Phillips opened the door and leapt out of the truck, rolling on the ground next to the road. Phillips sat up and watched the truck disappear through the hole. Moments later, version 2 ran in after it. With a final swing of his armored, spike-adorned tail, he vanished through the hole, and then it closed behind him. Reality merged back together, the warps vanished, and space smoothed out, and it closed, like it was never there. Both loops were now closed. Phillips sighed and sat up, looking back at Bride. He smiled at his friend and nodded. It was finally over. July 2045. The truck crashed into an old light pole and stopped. Steam hissing out from under the hood. Version 2 walked up to the open driver's side door and reached in and pulled the Die Glocke out. Clutching it close, he thought of where he should put it so no one would ever find it. He took it to a nearby muddy pond. It was a mud hole of water around 5 or 6 feet deep at its center. Not appealing to look at or fish in, a pond no one ever looked twice at, let alone would ever want to swim in. Once there, he smashed the Die Glocke against the ground a few times and then threw it into the pond where it sank out of sight into the murky water. Once the ripples disappeared, all traces of it were gone, and with it, all chances that anyone, considering how few humans were left, would ever find it. That night, version 2 was staying one more night in the same warehouse that had been home for the previous few nights. As the sun set, he gazed at the empty rolls of blankets Phillips and Bride had been using, and at the cold, burnt logs in their fire pit, and at the pile of weapons the two had left behind in their mad rush to chase the Nazis before they escaped. Tomorrow, he'd go back home to the community. Tonight, though, he just wanted to reflect. He thought about the whole incident, and the two friends he'd made. He'd always think of them as that. Friends. The three had shared something in their impossible meeting and impossible adventure, and in some ways, version 2 thought that they might have helped him find a way to deal with his own traumas. Maybe he wouldn't have to go out on his own anymore either. They really would have made great friends. It was unfortunate that they were born a century apart. He'd spend the night there at the warehouse and then go home tomorrow. But first, there was one more stop that he wanted to make on the way. April 1945. Phillips and Bride had finally reached the town they'd been traveling to when they'd found Vormann's little posse of extremists. It was a town that was little more than piles of rubble, wood, and bricks laid in piles, and buildings stood half demolished or just blown up. They'd hiked for miles following the skirmish and had finally made it. They sat together inside one of the destroyed buildings that had a wall collapsed, watching the movement on the street. The people who lived here were trying to rebuild already now that they were liberated from the Nazis' grasp, and American airborne infantry troops were moving around the town as well, some helping, some resting, some planning when they were going to move out and where to when they did. More American troops were coming and going non-stop as well. The town might have been little more than rubble, but there was still a feeling of hope. Someone, somewhere, was even playing a happy, if what, somber, tune on their violin. The two sailors sat in silence for most of the afternoon and evening, resting now that they finally had a true chance to do so in what felt like the first time in forever. Bride sipped on the coffee they'd been given by one of the infantry troops who had been nice enough to share some of his powdered rations with the exhausted sailors. He finally spoke and set his empty cup down on the table next to him. "It feels good to just sit down," he said. Phillips nodded. "Yeah, somewhere we don't have to worry about dying in 5 minutes, too," he replied, setting his own cup down. He shook his head. "It's been almost a week for us. Can you believe here it's only been about 24 hours since we found the train?" Bride chuckled. "Yeah, it's been about 24 hours since we got hanged, too," he said, rubbing his neck. "My neck is still sore." "Yeah, mine too," Phillips agreed, rubbing his neck as well. Bride didn't respond for a moment, then he said, "Did you really want to go back?" Phillips sighed. "I think part of me did, but you're right. We belong here. Our place is here. Just because the last few months have been hard, that doesn't change that. I think I'd have reached the same conclusion no matter where we ended up. The future, or, ancient Greece, or the Jurassic." Bride nodded. "I'm really happy you stayed," he said. "It wouldn't have been right without you here, especially with Blake and Tom gone." Phillips smiled back, then leaned back in his seat as a group of soldiers marched past outside. "Let's live a good life for them, all right," he said. Bride nodded in agreement. "For them. And us." They mutually agreed and went back to watching the activity in the town outside. "Maybe they're still out there, somewhere," Bride speculated optimistically. It was a nice thought, but neither felt deep down that they believed it. They also knew, and accepted, that they'd probably never know what happened to them. Philip spoke again after a minute. "Do you think the wreck of the YP-73 was still there in 2045? "Probably," Bride said. "Kinda trippy to think about, though. Her still being off the coast of Alaska over 100 years after we barely escaped her." "Yeah," Philip said. "I didn't really think about what might have still been out there that was here in our time. Now that I have a bit, it's kinda trippy. You're right. You just have to wonder how she looked by then." "You know what else is trippy? Our rifles are still in the future, too. Those ones I grabbed off the road, those are the ones we brought back," Bride said. Phillips nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it definitely is weird to think about," he said. "And the gold train, too. Do you think it was ever found in the future?" Bride shook his head and chuckled. "I don't know," he admitted. "It'd be nice. There was a lot of history on that train. Imagine what the Nazis could have stolen right out of the past and added to it if they still had the Die Glocke." "Do you think version 2 actually destroyed the Die Glocke?" Phillips then asked, looking more serious. God, I hope so. No one needs that kind of power, Bride replied, going back to watching the troops pass by outside. Roughly 3.5 weeks later, while on a U.S. Navy vessel anchored off the coast of Europe, while singing "We'll Meet Again" with the crew, they got the news. Adolf Hitler had shot himself in the Führer bunker. And just like that, the war in Europe was over, and the crew continued singing with renewed vigor, some even starting a celebratory dance with each other, now knowing that they would indeed meet their loved ones again. July 2045. Version 2 left the warehouse after the sun came up, and by mid-morning he was approaching a collapsed section of a wall that had once surrounded the walled-off section of a city, one now abandoned for many years. He didn't go inside its borders, he just stayed outside of it and stared at the abandoned city his creators lived in, the one he was born in, which now was merely an uninhabitable, trashed ruin that did not reflect at all what it had once been. The Patriots, as they called themselves, though they'd been far from it, people like the two sailors from 1945 he'd met were the real ones. The Patriots tried to force other communities under their flag through brutality, tried everything in their power to do it, create new weapons beyond what was thought possible, even ultimately creating him and his fellow hybrids. But everything they did ultimately came crashing down around them when they bit off more than they could chew. He contemplated the comments Phillips and Bride had said about them being similar to the Nazis they'd been fighting in the war. Maybe in the end, no matter how many evil regimes rose up and tried to force others under them by force, they'd always be defeated in the end by the good forces at play in the world. It was a reassuring notion, especially since other groups like them certainly existed somewhere beyond the community's borders, and maybe one day they would cross paths with them. Version 2 hoped the cycle continued as it had before. Meeting Phillips and Bride and getting a new perspective on his creators from them truly gave the hybrid a new appreciation for his freedom from his creators, both physically and mentally. He hated to imagine what he would have done had he remained brainwashed to them. He now appreciated the freedom he had and the life he had more than ever. And so, he felt more at peace with the things that had happened in the past. Phillips and Bride had shown him that a good future was ahead. He hoped that his little visit to the past had also done a tiny part to help them get to a similar future in their own time. That those evil people he had killed helped in the war just a tiny bit faster. It truly was a shame that they existed a century apart, but that meeting would be something he held close forever. With those thoughts, Version 2 stretched out in the grass, closed his eyes, and had a very content nap in the warm sun. Rumors of the Die Glocke vary. Some say it was an anti-gravity weapon. Some say it was a time machine. Some say it was stolen by the Allies, or traded to them by an SS colonel in exchange for his freedom. Some say it was buried with the Nazis' gold train. According to some reports, the prisoners in various concentration camps were supposedly exposed to radiation from the Die Glocke, and many of them suffered from death or severe health problems. The date of this supposed event is unknown. The Die Glocke, or the bell, itself is believed to have been conceived sometime in 1942 and first tested in 1944. The Die Glocke was supposedly 12 feet high and 9 feet long according to the original reports. Today, the fate of the Die Glocke is unknown, whether it was destroyed in the war or captured by the Allies in secret, or simply never existed in the first place. In 2003, an author claimed he found evidence of the Die Glocke's existence being true in World War II-era documents that had been classified by the Polish government. Other documents given to the same individual by an unknown government official stated that SS General Jacob Sporenberg allegedly confessed to ordering the murders of 60 individuals who knew about the Die Glocke. German rocket and aerospace engineers, who later went on to be employed by the United States following World War II, also supposedly knew of the Die Glocke. If the Die Glocke existed, to this day it has never been found for reasons unknown. Today, the Die Glocke's existence is postulated as nothing more than a mere urban legend.